In a forest clearing, a fallen tree becomes a nursery for new seedlings. Its decay feeds the soil that nourishes tomorrow's canopy. This quiet transformation reveals nature's most elegant secret. Balance emerges not from stillness, but from constant, gentle motion. Ecosystems maintain their stability through countless invisible threads, predator and prey locked in ancient rhythms, nutrients flowing in endless circles, species sharing resources through partnerships millions of years in the making. Tonight, we explore these delicate mechanisms that keep the natural world in harmonious equilibrium, where every ending becomes a beginning. Imagine walking through an old-growth forest where every element seems perfectly placed. The towering canopy filters sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Ferns unfurl in the gentle shadows, while fungi trace delicate networks through fallen logs. This apparent harmony is not accidental. It emerges from an intricate architecture that has been millions of years in the making, where each component supports and is supported by countless others. At its foundation, ecosystem balance rests on what ecologists call structural complexity. This isn't simply the physical arrangement of rocks, trees, and streams, though these certainly matter. Rather, it encompasses the layered organization of life itself, from the microscopic bacteria in soil to the apex predators that roam vast territories. Each level of this biological architecture contributes to the stability of the whole, creating what we might think of as nature's most sophisticated engineering project. Consider the vertical structure of that forest. The emergent trees, those giants that pierce above the main canopy, create a unique microclimate at their crowns. Here, epiphytes, plants that grow harmlessly on other plants, form aerial gardens sustained by mist and rain. Below them, the closed canopy forms a continuous green ceiling, intercepting most of the sun's energy and creating the conditions for everything beneath. The understory, bathed in filtered light, hosts shade-tolerant shrubs and young trees waiting for their chance to reach toward the sky. At ground level, herbs, mosses, and decomposers complete the vertical community, each layer dependent on those above and below. This layered structure does more than organize space efficiently. It creates stability through what ecologists call structural redundancy. If drought weakens the canopy trees, the understory can partially compensate by increasing photosynthesis in the brighter conditions. If a storm topples emergent giants, their fall creates gaps that allow suppressed trees to surge upward, maintaining the forest's overall productivity. No single layer bears the full responsibility for the ecosystem's function, and this redundancy provides resilience against disturbance. The horizontal architecture of ecosystems proves equally important. Landscape ecologists study how patches of different habitat types create mosaics that support greater diversity than any single habitat could alone. A meadow surrounded by forest edge provides nectar for butterflies, nesting sites for birds that prefer open areas, and hunting grounds for predators that venture from the woodland shadows. Streams create linear corridors that connect distant habitats, allowing fish to migrate, otters to travel, and riparian plants to disperse their seeds across watersheds. These spatial patterns create what scientists call habitat heterogeneity, a fundamental requirement for ecosystem balance. Homogeneous landscapes, where conditions remain uniform across large areas, typically support fewer species and prove more vulnerable to disturbance. Heterogeneous landscapes, with their mixture of habitats, microclimates, and resource patches, provide the variety that allows species to sort themselves into specialized niches, reducing competition and promoting coexistence. But the architecture of balance extends beyond what we can see. Beneath the visible landscape lies an invisible infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. Soil food webs connect decomposing leaves to earthworms, to ground beetles, to shrews in intricate chains of energy transfer. Mycorrhizal fungal networks link the roots of different tree species, sharing nutrients and even chemical signals about pest attacks. These underground connections often determine the health and stability of the communities above ground. In aquatic systems, architecture takes on different but equally important forms. Coral reefs demonstrate how biological structure creates ecosystem stability. The calcium carbonate skeletons, secreted by countless coral polyps over centuries, form complex three-dimensional frameworks. These structures provide shelter for fish, surfaces for algae, hiding places for invertebrates, and nursery areas for juvenile marine life. The physical complexity of the reef directly correlates with its biological diversity. Smooth, simplified reef structures support far fewer species than those with elaborate branching patterns and numerous crevices. Temperate lakes reveal another form of aquatic architecture through thermal stratification. During summer, warm surface water floats atop cooler, denser water below, creating distinct layers with different temperatures, oxygen levels, and nutrient concentrations. This stratification creates multiple habitat zones within a single body of water. Cool water fish like trout occupy the depths, while warm water species like bass patrol the shallows. Phytoplankton concentrate where light and nutrients intersect, typically in the upper layers, while decomposer organisms work in the oxygen-poor depths. This vertical zonation allows a single lake to support diverse communities that might otherwise compete destructively. The temporal dimension adds yet another layer to ecosystem architecture. Many ecosystems maintain balance through temporal partitioning, where different species use the same resources at different times. In deciduous forests, spring ephemeral wildflowers complete their entire life cycles before the trees above fully leaf out, capturing sunlight that will soon be blocked by the developing canopy. Nocturnal and diurnal species partition the same habitats by time, allowing both owls and hawks to hunt the same prey populations without direct competition. Seasonal cycles create predictable changes that many species have evolved to exploit. Migratory birds time their arrivals to coincide with peak insect abundance or fruit production. Many plants synchronize their flowering to avoid competition for pollinators or to take advantage of specific weather patterns. These temporal separations reduce competition and allow more species to coexist than would be possible if all were active simultaneously. The architecture of balance also includes what ecologists call functional diversity. While two forests might contain the same number of species, they could differ dramatically in their functional composition. One might be dominated by fast-growing species that quickly colonize disturbed areas but have short lifespans. Another might be characterized by slow-growing species that persist for centuries and gradually modify their environment. The functional traits of species, how they acquire resources, how they respond to stress, how they influence their environment, determine their roles in maintaining ecosystem stability. Nitrogen-fixing plants, like legumes, contribute a specific function that supports entire communities by converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms other plants can use. Large herbivores create disturbance through their feeding and trampling, maintaining grassland habitats that would otherwise succeed to forest. Apex predators control herbivore populations, preventing overgrazing that could simplify plant communities. Each functional group contributes to the ecosystem's overall stability through its particular role. Scale becomes crucial when considering ecosystem architecture. A single tree might seem insignificant in a vast forest, yet it influences soil chemistry beneath its canopy, provides nesting sites for dozens of bird species, and hosts hundreds of insect species on its bark, leaves, and in its hollow spaces. The health of entire watersheds can depend on the cumulative effects of millions of such individual trees, each contributing its small part to the larger architecture. Similarly, the microscopic realm proves foundational to ecosystem stability. Soil bacteria and fungi decompose organic matter, making nutrients available to plants. Marine phytoplankton, invisible to the naked eye, produce much of the oxygen we breathe and form the base of ocean food webs. These tiny organisms, through their collective activities, create conditions that allow larger, more visible species to thrive. The architecture of balance operates through what systems theorists call emergent properties, characteristics that arise from the interaction of components but cannot be predicted from studying those components in isolation. A forest's ability to regulate its own temperature through transpiration emerges from the collective behavior of individual trees, none of which could achieve this regulation alone. A coral reef's productivity emerges from the intricate relationships between corals, algae, fish, and countless invertebrates, each playing specialized roles that contribute to the whole. Understanding this architecture reveals why ecosystem balance is both robust and fragile. Robust because the complex, redundant structure provides multiple pathways for energy flow, numerous backup systems when particular species decline, and great flexibility in responding to environmental variation. Fragile because the intricate connections mean that disrupting key structural elements can cascade through the entire system, potentially causing collapse. This architectural perspective helps explain why conservation efforts increasingly focus on maintaining habitat connectivity, preserving structural complexity, and protecting entire landscapes rather than individual species. The architecture of balance cannot be preserved by saving isolated pieces. It requires maintaining the spatial patterns, temporal rhythms, and functional relationships that allow ecosystems to self-organize into stable, resilient configurations. As we settle deeper into our exploration of ecosystem balance, we begin to see that structure alone, however complex and elegant, cannot maintain stability without the dynamic processes that regulate how these systems function. The architecture provides the stage, but the real drama of balance unfolds through the countless feedback mechanisms that keep ecosystems from spiraling into chaos or collapse. In a quiet meadow, wild lupine flowers bloom in purple clusters, their roots hosting specialized bacteria that capture nitrogen from the air. As these plants enrich the soil with this essential nutrient, grasses and other wildflowers flourish around them. But as the meadow grows more lush and nitrogen rich, the lupines begin to struggle. Other plants outcompete them for sunlight and space. Gradually, the lupine population declines, nitrogen levels drop, and conditions return to favor these pioneering legumes once again. This gentle oscillation continues year after year, a perfect example of nature's self-regulating mechanisms in action. Feedback loops form the invisible steering system of ecosystems, the automatic controls that prevent runaway growth or collapse. Like a thermostat maintaining room temperature, these biological feedback mechanisms detect changes in ecosystem conditions and trigger responses that restore balance. Without them, populations would grow without limit until they consumed all available resources, or predator species would eliminate their prey entirely, destroying the very foundation of their own survival. The most fundamental type of regulation occurs through negative feedback loops, processes that counteract change and maintain stability. When any component of an ecosystem begins to deviate from its typical state, negative feedback mechanisms kick in to pull it back toward equilibrium. These loops operate at every level of biological organization, from individual cells to entire landscapes, creating the self-correcting properties that allow ecosystems to persist despite constant environmental variation. Consider how a forest regulates its own temperature through transpiration. On hot, sunny days, trees increase their rate of water loss through their leaves, cooling the air around them through evaporation. This biological air conditioning can lower forest temperatures by several degrees compared to adjacent, cleared areas. As temperatures drop and conditions become more comfortable, transpiration rates decrease, reducing the cooling effect. The forest thus maintains a relatively stable temperature environment that benefits all its inhabitants, while preventing the trees themselves from losing excessive water during heat stress. Soil chemistry provides another elegant example of negative feedback regulation. When soil becomes too acidic, certain chemical reactions slow down, reducing the breakdown of organic matter and the release of additional acids. Simultaneously, plants and soil organisms begin to suffer, reducing their contributions to soil acidity. Over time, these effects allow the soil pH to drift back toward more neutral conditions. Conversely, if soil becomes too alkaline, increased decomposition and root activity gradually lower the pH back toward optimal levels for most plants. These chemical feedback loops operate continuously and largely invisibly, making countless small adjustments that maintain soil conditions within ranges that support diverse plant communities. The beauty of these systems lies in their automatic nature. No central controller monitors soil chemistry and issues corrections. Instead, the chemical and biological properties of the soil itself create conditions that resist extreme changes in either direction. Population dynamics reveal feedback loops at their most dramatic. When prey animals become abundant, predator populations increase in response to the rich food supply. More predators mean greater predation pressure, which eventually reduces prey numbers. Fewer prey lead to starvation among predators, causing their populations to decline. With predation pressure reduced, prey populations can recover, beginning the cycle anew. This predator-prey oscillation, seen in systems from plankton in ponds to wolves and caribou in the Arctic, demonstrates how negative feedback prevents either species from completely dominating or eliminating the other. But ecosystems also experience positive feedback loops, processes that amplify changes rather than dampening them. While this might seem destabilizing, positive feedback often drives necessary transitions between stable states or helps ecosystems respond rapidly to environmental shifts. The key to ecosystem stability lies not in avoiding positive feedback, but in ensuring that negative feedback mechanisms eventually regain control. Succession following forest disturbance illustrates positive feedback in action. When a gap opens in the forest canopy, increased sunlight reaching the ground triggers rapid growth of pioneer species. These fast-growing plants further modify conditions by shading out competitors, changing soil chemistry through their leaf litter, and altering local humidity and temperature. Their success creates conditions that favor their continued dominance in the short term. However, longer term negative feedback eventually asserts itself as shade tolerant species gradually establish beneath the pioneers, eventually overtopping them and initiating the return to mature forest conditions. Positive feedback can also drive ecosystem collapse if negative feedback mechanisms fail. When excess nutrients enter a lake through runoff, algae populations explode in a classic positive feedback scenario. More algae mean more photosynthesis and faster growth, creating even larger populations. But this growth eventually overwhelms the system's regulatory mechanisms. When the algae die, their decomposition consumes oxygen, creating dead zones where fish and other organisms cannot survive. The lake ecosystem shifts to a degraded state that may persist for decades, demonstrating how positive feedback without adequate negative feedback controls can push ecosystems beyond their regulatory capacity. The timing of feedback responses critically influences ecosystem stability. Fast feedback loops provide immediate regulation, but may create unwanted oscillations if they overreact to small changes. Slow feedback loops provide more stable regulation, but may respond too late to prevent significant damage from rapid environmental changes. Healthy ecosystems typically employ multiple feedback mechanisms operating at different timescales, creating a hierarchical control system that maintains both short-term stability and long-term adaptability. Weather patterns demonstrate this multi-scale feedback regulation beautifully. Trees respond immediately to drought by closing their stomata, reducing water loss, but also limiting photosynthesis. This rapid response prevents immediate death from dehydration. If drought persists, longer term feedbacks engage as trees shed leaves, reduce growth, and allocate more resources to deep root systems. These slower responses help trees survive extended dry periods. If favorable conditions return, rapid feedback loops quickly restore normal function, while slower feedbacks gradually return the forest to its pre-drought state. Chemical communication adds another layer to ecosystem regulation through feedback loops. When attacked by herbivorous insects, many plants release volatile compounds that serve multiple regulatory functions. These chemical signals attract predatory insects that help control the herbivore population, providing negative feedback that limits plant damage. Simultaneously, these same chemicals warn neighboring plants to begin producing defensive compounds, creating a community-wide response that regulates herbivore populations before damage becomes severe. The rhizosphere, the soil zone immediately around plant roots, exemplifies the complexity of natural feedback systems. Plants release specific chemicals that attract beneficial microorganisms while deterring harmful ones. These recruited microbes enhance nutrient uptake, protect against pathogens, and improve soil structure. As soil conditions improve, plants grow more vigorously and release more root chemicals, strengthening their microbial partnerships. This positive feedback creates zones of enhanced plant health that gradually expand outward but are kept in check by resource limitations and competition with other plant microbe networks. Ecosystem engineers like beavers demonstrate how individual species can create feedback loops that regulate entire landscapes. When beavers build dams, they create ponds that attract waterfowl, support fish populations, and maintain year-round water supplies for terrestrial animals. The increased habitat diversity supports larger beaver populations, leading to more dam construction and expanded wetland areas. However, as beavers exhaust nearby food supplies or their ponds fill with sediment, they eventually abandon areas, allowing dams to break down and ecosystems to transition back toward their pre-disturbance states. This boom-bust cycle creates a shifting mosaic of wetland and terrestrial habitats across the landscape. Seasonal cycles impose external rhythms that interact with internal feedback loops to create predictable patterns of ecosystem regulation. Deciduous forests prepare for winter through a cascade of feedback mechanisms triggered by decreasing day length. Shorter days signal trees to begin withdrawing nutrients from their leaves, causing the spectacular color changes of autumn. As leaf drop progresses, the forest floor receives a massive input of organic matter, just as cooler temperatures slow decomposition, creating nutrient reserves that will support spring growth. This seasonal feedback loop synchronizes the entire forest community, ensuring that resources are conserved during winter and made available when growing conditions improve. Fire represents one of nature's most dramatic regulatory mechanisms, creating feedback loops that maintain ecosystem balance across vast landscapes. In fire adapted ecosystems, like grasslands and certain forests, accumulated plant material eventually reaches levels that increase fire risk. When fires occur, they clear away accumulated organic matter, release nutrients stored in plant tissues, and create favorable conditions for new growth. Many plants have evolved to not merely tolerate fire, but to depend on it for reproduction and competitive success. Their fire adaptations ensure that periodic burning continues, preventing the accumulation of so much fuel that eventual fires would destroy rather than regulate the ecosystem. The intricate web of feedback mechanisms in ecosystems creates what systems theorists call robust stability. Individual components may vary considerably, populations may fluctuate, and environmental conditions may change, but the overall system maintains its essential character through constant self-adjustment. This robustness emerges not from rigidity, but from the dynamic responsiveness of countless interacting feedback loops that collectively guide ecosystem development and maintain functional balance. Understanding these regulatory mechanisms reveals why ecosystem management often works best when it works with natural feedback systems rather than against them. Successful conservation strategies typically focus on maintaining the conditions that allow feedback loops to operate effectively rather than trying to control every aspect of ecosystem function directly. By preserving habitat connectivity, maintaining species diversity, and avoiding disruptions that overwhelm natural regulatory capacity, we can support the inherent stability that emerges from millions of years of evolutionary fine-tuning. As we delve deeper into the mechanisms of ecosystem balance, these feedback loops provide the foundation for understanding how individual populations regulate their own numbers and interactions. The regulatory principles that govern entire ecosystems also operate within species populations, creating the demographic patterns that prevent any single species from overwhelming its environment or disappearing entirely from the ecological stage. On a remote island in the North Pacific, a small population of reindeer was introduced in the early 1900s. With abundant vegetation, no predators, and favorable climate, the herd grew rapidly from its original 25 individuals. Within decades, the population had exploded to over 6,000 animals. But this success story soon turned tragic. The reindeer had consumed nearly every edible plant on the island, transforming lush meadows into barren ground. Winter arrived to find the animals weakened and malnourished. By the following spring, fewer than 50 reindeer remained alive, and within a few more years, the population had vanished entirely. This stark example reveals what happens when populations grow beyond their environment's ability to sustain them. Every population exists within the constraints of its environment's carrying capacity, the maximum number of individuals that can be supported indefinitely by available resources. This invisible ceiling operates through the interplay of birth rates, death rates, immigration, and emigration. When populations remain below carrying capacity, resources are abundant, competition is limited, and conditions favor growth. As populations approach this threshold, however, subtle changes begin to occur that gradually slow population increase and eventually establish equilibrium. The concept of carrying capacity might suggest a fixed number, but in reality, it fluctuates with environmental conditions, resource availability, and the population's own impact on its habitat. A forest might support 100 deer during years of mild winters and abundant acorn crops, but only 60 during harsh winters when browse becomes scarce. The deer population itself influences this capacity by affecting vegetation through browsing pressure. Heavy grazing can reduce plant diversity and abundance, lowering the habitat's ability to support large deer numbers in subsequent years. Density-dependent factors form the primary mechanism through which populations regulate their own growth. As population density increases, the effects of competition, predation, disease, and stress become more pronounced, creating natural brakes on further population growth. These factors operate proportionally to population size, intensifying as numbers rise and relaxing as numbers fall, creating the negative feedback loops that prevent populations from growing indefinitely. Competition intensifies as population density increases, affecting everything from access to food and nesting sites to mating opportunities. When Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands become numerous, individuals must search longer and travel farther to find seeds, expending more energy for the same nutritional reward. Weaker individuals may fail to secure adequate resources, reducing their survival and reproductive success. This competitive stress naturally culls populations back towards sustainable levels before resources become completely exhausted. Territoriality provides another density-dependent mechanism for population regulation. Many bird species establish and defend territories that contain the resources needed for successful breeding. High-quality territories get claimed first by the most competitive individuals, while later arrivals must settle for marginal habitats or fail to breed entirely. This territorial system effectively limits breeding populations to the number of suitable territories available, preventing overexploitation of resources within any single area. Disease transmission accelerates in dense populations, creating another powerful regulatory mechanism. When individuals live in close proximity, pathogens spread more rapidly and efficiently through the population. Crowded conditions also increase stress levels, which can suppress immune function and make individuals more susceptible to infection. Epidemic diseases can dramatically reduce population sizes, often overshooting carrying capacity limits and creating periods of low density that allow both the population and its resources to recover. The European rabbit populations in Australia demonstrate this disease regulation dramatically. Introduced in the 19th century, rabbits multiplied explosively in their new environment, reaching plague proportions and devastating native vegetation. When myxomatosis virus was introduced as a biological control agent in the 1,950 seconds, it swept through rabbit populations with devastating effect, killing over 99% of infected animals. The dramatic population crash allowed vegetation to recover, and surviving rabbits, now with some disease resistance, stabilized at much lower population levels that the environment could sustain. Predation pressure typically increases with prey density, providing external regulation of population growth. When prey becomes more abundant, predators encounter food more frequently, allowing them to reproduce more successfully and increase their own numbers. The growing predator population eventually creates enough predation pressure to reduce prey numbers, demonstrating how species interactions contribute to population regulation, even when the regulating species is external to the regulated population. Social stress emerges as a particularly fascinating density-dependent factor in many mammal populations. As crowding increases, social interactions become more frequent and often more aggressive. Subordinate individuals experience chronic stress that can reduce their reproductive success, immune function, and survival rates. In some rodent populations, this social stress can trigger physiological changes that reduce fertility rates across the entire population, creating an internal mechanism for population control that operates before resource limitations become severe. The snowshoe hare populations of the Canadian boreal forest illustrate the complex interplay of regulatory mechanisms. These populations undergo regular cycles of abundance and scarcity roughly every 10 years. As hare numbers increase, they face increasing pressure from multiple sources. Predators like lynx, great horned owls, and goshawks multiply in response to abundant prey. Meanwhile, the hares themselves begin to overbrowse their preferred winter food sources, particularly young aspen shoots and willow branches. But the most intriguing aspect of the hare cycle involves maternal effects that persist across generations. Females, stressed by high population density and predation pressure, produce offspring that show reduced survival and reproductive success, even when raised in favorable conditions. These maternal effects appear to help prolong the low phase of population cycles, preventing rapid recovery that might lead to another boom-bust sequence. The mechanism ensures that populations remain low long enough for vegetation to recover and predator numbers to decline. Life history strategies profoundly influence how populations approach and respond to carrying capacity limits. Species with rapid reproductive rates and short generation times can increase quickly when conditions are favorable, but may also overshoot carrying capacity and experience dramatic crashes. These opportunistic species, often called R-selected, include many insects, small mammals, and annual plants. Their populations tend to fluctuate widely, sometimes reaching very high densities during favorable periods. In contrast, species with slower reproductive rates and longer generation times typically show more stable population dynamics. These equilibrium species, termed K-selected, include most large mammals, long-lived birds, and perennial trees. Their populations tend to remain closer to carrying capacity with smaller fluctuations, but they recover more slowly from population declines and may be more vulnerable to sustained environmental changes. Immigration and emigration add spatial dimensions to population regulation. When local populations exceed their habitat's carrying capacity, individuals may disperse to less crowded areas, exporting the excess population to locations where resources are more abundant. This emigration reduces density in the source population while potentially establishing new populations or reinforcing existing ones in sink habitats. Young animals often disperse from their birth areas when they reach maturity, reducing competition with parents and siblings while seeking their own territories or breeding opportunities. This dispersal behavior prevents populations from building up to destructive levels in particularly favorable habitats while maintaining genetic connections between geographically separated populations. Seasonal and annual variation in carrying capacity creates dynamic population regulation that reflects environmental fluctuations. Populations may grow during favorable seasons, only to be reduced by winter mortality or summer drought. Migratory species often track these seasonal changes in carrying capacity, following resource availability across landscapes and avoiding the full impact of seasonal resource limitations. Tree seed production demonstrates this temporal variation beautifully. Many tree species produce large seed crops only every few years, creating mast years when food is superabundant for seed-eating animals like squirrels, mice, and birds. These animals increase rapidly during mast years, often reaching population densities far above what the habitat can support during normal years. When seed production returns to typical levels, the enlarged animal populations face intense competition and high mortality, quickly returning to sustainable levels. Climate change adds new complexity to population regulation by altering carrying capacity in unpredictable ways. Shifting temperature and precipitation patterns change the abundance and distribution of food resources, modify habitat suitability, and alter the timing of biological events like reproduction and migration. Populations adapted to historical carrying capacity limits may find themselves in environments with different resource constraints, potentially disrupting long established regulatory mechanisms. Understanding population dynamics and carrying capacity reveals the delicate balance between growth, potential, and environmental limitations that shapes all life on Earth. Each population exists within a web of constraints and opportunities that have been refined by millions of years of evolutionary trial and error. These regulatory mechanisms ensure that species persist without destroying the very resources upon which their survival depends, maintaining the stability that allows ecosystems to support their full complement of interacting species. The regulatory mechanisms operating within single populations become even more complex when we consider how different species interact with each other. Predator and prey populations create some of nature's most elegant regulatory systems, with each population controlling the other through feedback mechanisms that have fascinated ecologists for generations. These interspecific relationships add new layers of complexity to the regulatory processes that maintain ecosystem balance. In the vast wilderness of Alaska's Denali National Park, a pack of wolves moves silently through the tundra, their keen senses tracking a herd of caribou across the windswept landscape. This ancient dance between predator and prey has played out for thousands of years, each participant locked in an evolutionary embrace that shapes not only their own populations, but the entire ecosystem around them. The wolves depend entirely on the caribou for survival, yet their predation ensures that caribou numbers remain within limits that the fragile Arctic vegetation can sustain. Neither species can exist without the other, and their intertwined fates create one of nature's most elegant regulatory systems. Predator-prey relationships form the backbone of ecosystem regulation, creating dynamic balances that prevent any single species from overwhelming its environment. These relationships operate through intricate feedback mechanisms where each population influences the other in predictable patterns. When prey becomes abundant, predators have more food available, leading to increased survival and reproduction among predators. As predator numbers grow, they exert greater pressure on prey populations, eventually reducing prey abundance. Fewer prey means less food for predators, causing predator populations to decline, which releases pressure on prey and allows their recovery. This cyclical dance continues indefinitely, creating oscillating population levels that maintain both species within sustainable ranges. The classic example of predator-prey cycles comes from the Hudson's Bay Company trading records spanning nearly 2 centuries. These meticulously kept records document the number of lynx and snowshoe hare pelts traded each year, revealing remarkably regular population cycles lasting roughly 10 years. Hare populations build slowly, then surge to peak numbers before crashing dramatically. Lynx populations follow the same pattern, but with a delay of 1 to 2 years. When hares become scarce, lynx face starvation and their numbers plummet. With predation pressure reduced, surviving hares begin to recover, setting the stage for another cycle. However, recent research has revealed that this relationship involves more complexity than simple predator-prey dynamics. Snowshoe hares also face pressure from other predators, including great horned owls, goshawks, and coyotes. The vegetation they depend on for winter survival shows its own cyclical patterns of abundance and quality. Maternal stress effects, where females experiencing high predation pressure produce offspring with reduced fitness, help extend the low phases of hare cycles. This multi-factor regulation demonstrates how predator-prey relationships embed within broader ecosystem contexts. Marine ecosystems reveal predator-prey regulation at oceanic scales. In the North Pacific, sea otters prey heavily on sea urchins, which in turn graze on kelp forests. When sea otters are present, they keep urchin populations in check, allowing kelp forests to flourish. These underwater forests support hundreds of fish species, provide nursery habitat for many marine organisms, and protect coastlines from storm damage. When otter populations decline due to hunting pressure or predation by killer whales, urchin populations explode, creating underwater barrens where kelp once grew. The loss of kelp forests cascades through the entire ecosystem, demonstrating how predator-prey relationships can influence entire habitat types. This sea otter example illustrates the concept of a trophic cascade, where effects of predation flow down through multiple levels of the food web. Wolves in Yellowstone National Park create another well-documented trophic cascade. After wolves were reintroduced to the park in 1995, elk behavior changed dramatically. No longer able to linger safely in valley bottoms, elk spent more time in upland areas and moved more frequently between feeding sites. This behavioral shift reduced browsing pressure on willows and aspens in riparian areas, allowing these trees to recover. Returning vegetation stabilized stream banks, created habitat for songbirds, and supported beaver populations that had struggled in the overgrazed landscape. The Yellowstone wolves also demonstrate how predation can improve prey population health through selective pressure. Wolves typically target the youngest, oldest, and weakest individuals in prey populations, removing animals that are least likely to survive harsh winters or reproduce successfully. This selective predation can improve the overall fitness and disease resistance of prey populations, creating what ecologists call the the landscape of fear, where the mere presence of predators influences prey behavior and distribution patterns. Different hunting strategies create varying regulatory effects on prey populations. Coursing predators like wolves and African wild dogs chase down prey over long distances, often selecting for the weakest individuals that cannot maintain the pace. Ambush predators like big cats and crocodiles rely on stealth and explosive power, potentially taking a broader cross section of prey populations. Sit and wait predators, like many spiders and snakes, may take whatever prey happens to encounter them, creating more random selection pressure. These different predation styles interact with prey anti predator strategies to create complex coevolutionary dynamics. Prey species develop increasingly sophisticated defenses, from the incredible speed of gazelles to the warning coloration of poison dart frogs. Predators respond with enhanced hunting abilities, better camouflage, or more effective toxins. This evolutionary arms race drives continuous adaptation in both predator and prey species, contributing to the incredible diversity of hunting and escape strategies observed in nature. Group hunting in predators creates unique regulatory dynamics. Wolf packs can bring down prey much larger than individual wolves could handle, allowing them to exploit resources unavailable to solitary hunters. Coordinated hunting also increases success rates, making predation pressure more consistent and predictable. However, group hunting requires sharing prey among pack members, limiting the number of individuals that can be supported by each successful hunt. These social constraints create natural limits on predator abundance that interact with prey availability to regulate both populations. Switching behavior in predators adds stability to predator-prey systems by preventing any single prey species from being driven to extinction. When preferred prey becomes scarce, many predators shift to alternative food sources, reducing pressure on the declining prey population and allowing its recovery. Coyotes demonstrate this flexibility by switching between small mammals, fruits, insects, and even garbage, depending on seasonal availability and local abundance. This dietary flexibility allows coyote populations to persist through fluctuations in any single food source while providing more stable regulation of multiple prey species. Temporal separation creates another dimension of predator-prey regulation. Many prey species are active during times when their primary predators are less active, reducing encounter rates and predation pressure. Nocturnal rodents avoid diurnal hawks and eagles, while diurnal ground squirrels escape most owl predation. Seasonal migrations allow prey species to escape predators during vulnerable periods like reproduction and molting. These temporal refuges prevent predator-prey relationships from becoming so intense that prey populations collapse entirely. Spatial refuges play equally important roles in maintaining predator-prey balance. Complex habitats provide hiding places where prey can escape predation, ensuring that some individuals survive even when predator pressure is intense. Coral reefs offer countless crevices where small fish can hide from larger predators. Forest understory provides cover for small mammals, avoiding aerial predators. These refuges create source areas where prey populations can recover during periods of high predation pressure. Intraguild predation, where predators also prey upon each other, adds complexity to simple predator-prey models. Large predators often kill smaller predators, both to eliminate competition for shared prey and as direct food sources. Lions kill leopards and cheetahs, reducing competition for ungulate prey. Great horned owls prey on smaller owl species, eliminating competitors while supplementing their diet. These interactions create multi-level regulatory networks where predation operates both within and between trophic levels. Disease dynamics interact with predation to create additional regulatory mechanisms. Predators often remove sick and weakened prey individuals, reducing disease transmission within prey populations. However, predators can also serve as disease vectors, spreading pathogens between prey populations or maintaining disease reservoirs that periodically reduce prey numbers. Rabies in wolves and distemper in wild dogs can dramatically reduce predator populations, releasing prey from predation pressure and potentially leading to prey population eruptions. Climate affects predator-prey relationships through multiple pathways. Harsh winters may weaken prey animals, making them more vulnerable to predation, but may also reduce predator hunting efficiency through deep snow or extreme cold. Drought can concentrate both predators and prey around limited water sources, intensifying predation pressure. Climate change alters these traditional patterns, potentially disrupting predator-prey cycles that have persisted for millennia. Human activities profoundly influence predator-prey dynamics through habitat fragmentation, direct persecution of predators, and introduction of non-native species. The elimination of large predators from many ecosystems has released prey populations from their primary regulatory mechanism, often leading to overabundance and ecosystem degradation. Conversely, the introduction of novel predators can devastate native prey species that lack evolutionary defenses against unfamiliar hunting strategies. Understanding predator-prey relationships reveals them as finely tuned regulatory systems that have evolved over millions of years. Each relationship represents a unique solution to the challenge of maintaining population balance while allowing both predator and prey species to persist. These interactions create stability through constant change, with populations rising and falling in patterns that prevent either extinction or overabundance. The regulatory power of predator-prey relationships extends beyond the species directly involved, influencing entire communities through cascading effects on vegetation, habitat structure, and other species interactions. As we explore further into the mechanisms of ecosystem balance, we discover that predation represents just one type of species interaction that maintains stability. Competition between species creates another powerful regulatory force that shapes community structure and prevents any single species from monopolizing available resources. In the canopy of a Costa Rican rainforest, 5 species of hummingbirds visit the same flowering tree, each one specialized for flowers at different heights and with different shapes. The smallest species, with its needle-like bill, probes the tiny tubular flowers near the tree's crown. Mid-sized species work the intermediate branches, their bills perfectly matched to medium-sized blooms. The largest hummingbird dominates the broad, deep flowers at the tree's base, its powerful bill and body size allowing access to nectar sources too large for its smaller relatives. Despite sharing the same tree and the same basic food source, these species coexist harmoniously through intricate divisions of labor that have evolved over millions of years. Competition for limited resources would seem to doom similar species to conflict, with winners eliminating losers in a biological arms race. Yet nature reveals countless examples of closely related species living side by side, each occupying its own niche within shared habitats. This coexistence emerges through resource partitioning, where species divide available resources along multiple dimensions, reducing direct competition and allowing diverse communities to flourish where simple theory might predict only single dominant species. The competitive exclusion principle states that two species with identical ecological requirements cannot coexist indefinitely in the same environment. One will inevitably outcompete the other, leading to local extinction of the inferior competitor. This principle, demonstrated in countless laboratory experiments, suggests that natural communities should contain only a few highly competitive species, yet tropical rainforests may contain hundreds of tree species in a single hectare. Coral reefs support thousands of fish species in relatively small areas, and temperate forests host dozens of bird species that all seem to eat insects and nest in trees. This apparent contradiction resolves when we examine how species partition resources along multiple dimensions simultaneously. The classic study of warblers in New England forests revealed how five closely related species divide their foraging territories. Each warbler species concentrates its feeding activities in different zones of coniferous trees. Bay-breasted warblers forage primarily in the interior branches of the middle canopy, while Cape May warblers focus on the outer branches of the upper canopy. Blackburnian warblers specialize in the tree crowns, yellow-rumped warblers work the lower branches, and black-throated green warblers occupy the middle zones, but prefer the outer portions of branches. These spatial separations would seem to provide adequate resource partitioning, but the warblers also divide resources temporally. Different species begin their breeding seasons at slightly different times, reducing competition for nesting sites and peak insect abundance. They employ different foraging techniques, with some species gleaning insects from leaf surfaces, while others probe bark crevices or hawk flying insects. Even their preferred insect prey differs subtly in size, type, and location, creating multiple dimensions of resource separation that allow all five species to coexist in the same forest patches. Character displacement demonstrates how competition shapes species evolution to reduce direct conflict. When two similar species occur together, natural selection favors individuals with traits that reduce competition with the other species. Over evolutionary time, this process can lead to divergence in morphology, behavior, or ecology that minimizes resource overlap. Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands provide textbook examples of this process. On islands where only one seed-eating finch species occurs, individuals show relatively uniform bill sizes suited to the average seed size available. But on islands where two finch species coexist, their bills diverge dramatically. One species evolves larger, more powerful bills suited to cracking large, hard seeds, while the other develops smaller, more delicate bills optimized for handling small seeds. This character displacement allows both species to coexist by specializing on different portions of the available seed resources. Body size differences often facilitate coexistence among competing species by creating hierarchies of resource access. In many carnivore communities, large predators like lions take the largest prey. Medium-sized predators like leopards focus on medium-sized prey, and small predators like caracals specialize in small prey. While some overlap exists, the size differences create distinct optimal prey ranges that reduce direct competition. When prey becomes scarce, larger predators may expand into smaller prey categories, but their hunting efficiency decreases, maintaining opportunities for smaller predators. Temporal resource partitioning allows species to share the same resources by using them at different times. Many desert mammals avoid competition through temporal segregation, with some species active during cooler night hours, while others emerge during dawn and dusk periods. Flowering plants often bloom at different times of the year, reducing competition for pollinators while ensuring that flowers are available throughout the growing season. Even daily activity patterns can create temporal niches, with early morning birds giving way to midday specialists and evening feeders. Dietary specialization represents one of the most common forms of resource partitioning. In African savannas, multiple herbivore species coexist by feeding on different parts of the same plants or preferring different plant species. Zebras, with their strong grinding teeth, can process tough grasses that other species cannot handle effectively. Their grazing removes the coarse upper portions of grass tufts, exposing more tender growth that wildebeest prefer. Gazelles, with their small mouths and selective feeding behavior, focus on the highest quality plant parts, often feeding on areas that larger herbivores have already processed. This grazing succession creates a facilitation cascade where each species makes resources more accessible for the next. Elephants knock down trees and create grasslands that support grazers. Large grazers like buffalo create short grass conditions favored by smaller antelopes. The collective effect maintains diverse plant communities that support the full spectrum of herbivore species, demonstrating how apparent competition can actually enhance coexistence through complementary resource use. Microhabitat specialization allows competing species to coexist within seemingly uniform environments by exploiting subtle environmental differences. Stream insects demonstrate this principle beautifully. Different mayfly species prefer different water velocities, substrate types, and oxygen levels within the same stream reach. Some species thrive in fast-flowing riffles over rocky bottoms, while others prefer slower pools with sandy substrates. Water temperature, pH, and dissolved nutrients create additional gradients that insects can partition, allowing dozens of species to coexist in stream segments that appear homogeneous to casual observation. Soil chemistry creates similar partitioning opportunities for plants. Different species prefer different pH levels, nutrient concentrations, moisture conditions, and soil textures. These preferences often correlate with physiological adaptations that allow plants to thrive under specific soil conditions while struggling in others. The result is fine-scale mosaics of plant species distributions that reflect underlying soil heterogeneity invisible to the naked eye. Interference competition occurs when species directly interfere with each other's resource access through aggressive behavior, allelopathy, or exploitation of shared enemies. Many plant species release chemical compounds that inhibit the growth of potential competitors, creating zones of reduced plant diversity around the allelopathic species. These chemicals can persist in soil for extended periods, maintaining competitive advantages even when the parent plant dies. Territorial behavior in animals creates spatial resource monopolies that can facilitate coexistence through clear resource divisions. When territories are established, direct confrontations decrease as individuals recognize and respect territorial boundaries. Different species often establish territories of different sizes or in different habitat types, creating spatial segregation that reduces competition. Interspecific territoriality, where individuals defend territories against other species as well as their own, can create more complex spatial patterns that promote coexistence through forced habitat segregation. Apparent competition occurs when two species compete indirectly through shared natural enemies rather than shared resources. If two prey species share the same predators, an increase in one prey species can lead to increased predator populations that then reduce the other prey species. This indirect competitive effect can be as strong as direct resource competition and may explain coexistence patterns that seem puzzling based on resource availability alone. The storage effect promotes coexistence by allowing species to recover during favorable periods and persist through unfavorable ones. Species with different responses to environmental variation can coexist if each experiences occasional periods when conditions favor its population growth over competitors. Seeds that remain dormant during unfavorable years exemplify this mechanism. Different species may germinate in response to different rainfall patterns, temperature regimes, or disturbance events, creating temporal storage that buffets populations against competitive exclusion. Neutral theory challenges traditional competition-based explanations for coexistence by proposing that many species are functionally equivalent competitors whose coexistence results from random demographic processes rather than niche differentiation. According to this view, species abundances reflect the balance between speciation, extinction, and immigration rather than competitive differences. While controversial, neutral theory has sparked important discussions about the relative importance of niche-based versus neutral processes in maintaining biodiversity. Invasive species demonstrate what happens when coexistence mechanisms break down. Introduced species often lack the evolutionary history of resource partitioning that allows native species to coexist. Without established niche boundaries, invasive species may compete more directly with native species, potentially leading to competitive exclusion. However, even invasive species often eventually develop resource partitioning relationships with native communities, suggesting that coexistence mechanisms can evolve relatively rapidly when strong selection pressures exist. Climate change threatens established coexistence patterns by altering resource availability, changing optimal habitat conditions, and shifting the competitive balance between species. Species that have coexisted for millennia may find their resource partitioning strategies inadequate under novel environmental conditions. Some species may benefit from changing conditions while their competitors suffer, potentially leading to competitive exclusion and reduced diversity in communities that have been stable for thousands of years. Understanding competition and coexistence reveals the intricate mechanisms that allow diverse communities to persist despite limited resources. These mechanisms represent millions of years of evolutionary fine-tuning, creating stable coexistence patterns that maximize resource use efficiency while maintaining species diversity. The delicate balance between competition and coexistence demonstrates how ecological communities achieve stability through differentiation rather than domination, creating space for the remarkable diversity of life we observe in natural ecosystems. As we delve deeper into the relationships that maintain ecosystem balance, competition represents only one side of the species interaction spectrum. While competition drives species apart into distinct niches, mutualistic relationships draw species together in cooperative partnerships that often prove essential for ecosystem functioning. These mutually beneficial relationships create some of nature's most stable and productive partnerships, forming networks of interdependence that strengthen rather than strain ecosystem resilience. Deep beneath a Douglas fir forest, An intricate web of fungal threads connects tree roots across acres of woodland. These gossamer strands, finer than spider silk, link individual trees in a vast underground network that shares nutrients, water, and even chemical messages about insect attacks or drought stress. A mother tree, centuries old and towering above the canopy, channels carbon rich sugars through this network to support her offspring struggling in the understory shadows. In return, the young trees may someday reciprocate, sharing resources when the ancient giant faces her own times of need. This wood wide web, as scientists have come to call it, represents one of nature's most sophisticated examples of mutual cooperation, where individual success depends entirely on community welfare. Mutualistic relationships, partnerships where both participants benefit, form the cooperative backbone of ecosystem stability. Unlike the competitive interactions that drive species apart into distinct niches, mutualistic relationships bind species together in interdependent networks that often prove more resilient than any single species could achieve alone. These partnerships have evolved independently countless times throughout Earth's history, suggesting that cooperation provides fundamental advantages for survival in an uncertain world. The most visible mutualistic relationships involve pollination, where flowering plants trade nectar and pollen rewards for transportation services that allow their genes to spread across the landscape. This ancient partnership between plants and their pollinators has shaped the evolution of both groups over hundreds of millions of years, creating some of the most intricate coevolutionary relationships known to science. The variety of pollination partnerships staggers the imagination, from tiny midges pollinating cacao flowers to bats visiting night-blooming desert cacti. Orchids demonstrate pollination mutualism at its most specialized. Many orchid species have evolved flowers precisely shaped to fit specific pollinator species, creating lock and key relationships where only certain insects can access the flower's rewards. The bucket orchid of Central America creates a slippery walled chamber that male bees fall into, forcing them to exit through a narrow tunnel that precisely positions pollen packets on their bodies. The bee receives fragrance compounds essential for attracting mates, while the orchid achieves pollination with remarkable efficiency. Such specialized relationships create stable partnerships that have persisted for millions of years. However, extreme specialization also creates vulnerability. If either partner suffers population decline, both species may face extinction. This risk has led to the evolution of generalized pollination networks, where multiple plant species share multiple pollinator species, creating web-like structures that provide backup options when particular partnerships fail. Prairie ecosystems exemplify this approach, with dozens of wildflower species sharing bees, butterflies, and other pollinators in overlapping networks that provide insurance against the loss of any single relationship. Seed dispersal represents another crucial mutualistic service that has shaped plant evolution and community structure. Plants that produce fleshy fruits essentially pay animals to transport their seeds to new locations, often far from the parent plant, where competition would be intense and success unlikely. The trade benefits both partners. Animals receive nutritious food rewards, while plants achieve wide seed dispersal that colonizes new habitats and maintains genetic diversity across fragmented landscapes. Tropical forests depend heavily on seed dispersal mutualisms, with many tree species producing fruits specifically designed to attract particular animal dispersers. Large fruits with hard seeds appeal to toucans and hornbills, whose powerful bills can crack tough shells. Small, soft fruits attract songbirds that swallow seeds whole and deposit them intact in their droppings. Bright red fruits stand out against green foliage to attract birds, while dark purple or black fruits appeal to mammals active during twilight hours. The strangler figs of tropical forests have evolved particularly sophisticated dispersal strategies. Their tiny seeds, embedded in sweet figs, attract dozens of bird and mammal species. Many of these animals deposit seeds in tree crotches high in the forest canopy, where the fig seedlings begin life as epiphytes before sending roots down to the ground. This aerial germination strategy allows figs to compete for sunlight in the forest canopy rather than struggling in the dim understory, demonstrating how mutualistic relationships can drive innovative life history strategies. Cleaning mutualisms create some of the ocean's most visible cooperative relationships. Cleaner fish establish cleaning stations on coral reefs, where larger fish come to have parasites, dead skin, and infected tissues removed. The cleaners receive nutritious meals, while their clients enjoy improved health and reduced parasite loads. These relationships often involve elaborate behavioral rituals that prevent the larger fish from simply eating their smaller partners. Cleaner wrasses advertise their services through distinctive coloration and dancing movements that signal their identity to potential clients. Large predatory fish that would normally consume small wrasses instead hover motionlessly while cleaners work, even opening their mouths and gill covers to allow access to internal surfaces. The trust displayed in these relationships seems remarkable, yet it demonstrates how mutualistic benefits can override predatory instincts when cooperation proves more valuable than conflict. Marine cleaning stations function as neutral zones where natural enemies interact peacefully, creating temporal refuges from predation that benefit entire reef communities. Multiple cleaner species often work the same stations, creating service diversity that ensures cleaning availability even when particular cleaner populations fluctuate. Some fish travel considerable distances to visit cleaning stations, indicating the high value they place on these services. Mycorrhizal relationships between plant roots and soil fungi represent perhaps the most ecologically important mutualistic partnership on Earth. Over 90% of plant species participate in these relationships, which essentially extend plant root systems through fungal networks that can increase nutrient and water absorption by orders of magnitude. The fungi receive carbon compounds from plant photosynthesis, while plants gain access to soil resources they cannot reach with roots alone. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi form the most common type of these partnerships, penetrating root cell walls and creating intricate branching structures that facilitate nutrient exchange. These fungi cannot survive without plant partners, while most plants struggle severely in soils lacking appropriate mycorrhizal partners. The relationship represents true biological integration, where neither partner can complete its life cycle independently. Ectomycorrhizal fungi, common in temperate and boreal forests, form sheaths around tree roots and create extensive hyphal networks through forest soils. These networks can connect trees of different species, creating interspecific sharing of resources that stabilizes forest communities during environmental stress. Carbon flows from photosynthetically active trees to those experiencing shade, drought, or defoliation, while nutrients flow from trees with access to rich soil patches to those growing in nutrient-poor areas. Research has revealed that these mycorrhizal networks facilitate communication between trees through chemical signals. When attacked by insects, trees can send warning signals through fungal networks that cause neighboring trees to increase their production of defensive compounds. This early warning system allows forest communities to mount coordinated defenses against pest outbreaks, demonstrating how mutualistic networks create emergent properties that benefit entire ecosystems. Nitrogen fixation partnerships between leguminous plants and rhizobia bacteria create another foundational mutualistic relationship that supports terrestrial ecosystems. Atmospheric nitrogen, though abundant, exists in a form most organisms cannot use directly. Rhizobia bacteria possess enzymes capable of converting atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, which plants can readily absorb and use for protein synthesis. In exchange for this service, legumes provide bacteria with carbohydrates and specialized root nodules that create optimal conditions for nitrogen fixation. These partnerships allow legumes to thrive in nitrogen poor soils where other plants struggle, often serving as pioneer species that colonize degraded landscapes. As legumes grow and eventually decompose, they enrich soils with nitrogen that becomes available to other plant species. This process of biological nitrogen enrichment supports succession in many ecosystems and maintains soil fertility in agricultural systems that incorporate leguminous cover crops. Ant plant mutualisms showcase some of the most elaborate cooperative relationships in tropical ecosystems. Acacia trees in Central America house specialized ant colonies in hollow thorns while providing nectar from extrafloral nectaries and protein-rich food bodies that meet all the nutritional needs of their ant partners. In return, the ants aggressively defend their host trees against herbivorous insects, competing vegetation, and even large mammals that might browse acacia foliage. These ant bodyguards patrol acacia trees continuously, attacking any arthropods that attempt to feed on leaves and removing competing plants that grow too close to their host tree's base. The protection is so effective that acacias with ant partners grow faster, suffer less herbivore damage, and reproduce more successfully than those without ant colonies. The relationship has become so specialized that neither partner can survive without the other, representing evolutionary integration at the species level. Coral reef ecosystems depend entirely on mutualistic partnerships between coral animals and symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae. These single-celled algae live within coral tissues, conducting photosynthesis and sharing up to 90% of their carbon production with their coral hosts. In return, corals provide protected habitat and access to nutrients from their feeding activities. This partnership allows coral reefs to achieve extraordinary productivity in the nutrient-poor waters of tropical oceans. The coral algae partnership creates the energy foundation that supports entire reef ecosystems. Coral growth rates in tropical waters far exceed what would be possible from coral feeding alone, allowing reefs to keep pace with sea level rise and recover from storm damage. When environmental stress disrupts this partnership, corals expel their algal partners in a process called bleaching that often leads to coral death and reef collapse. Mutualistic networks create stability through redundancy and alternative pathways that buffer ecosystems against disturbance. When particular species decline or disappear, their mutualistic partners may form new relationships with other species, maintaining ecosystem functions even as species composition changes. However, these networks also create interdependencies that can lead to cascading failures when keystone mutualistic relationships collapse Understanding mutualistic networks reveals them as invisible infrastructure that supports ecosystem productivity and stability. These cooperative relationships create positive feedback loops where partner success reinforces the partnership, leading to increasingly tight integration over evolutionary time. Unlike competitive relationships that create zero sum games, mutualistic partnerships generate mutual benefits that enhance ecosystem wide productivity and resilience. The intricate webs of mutualistic relationships demonstrate how cooperation has shaped life's evolution as profoundly as competition. These partnerships create the foundation for energy flows and nutrient cycles that we explore next, showing how mutualistic networks channel resources through ecosystems in patterns that maintain balance and support the remarkable diversity of life on Earth. In the crystal clear waters of Lake Tahoe, microscopic phytoplankton drift near the surface, their chlorophyll molecules capturing sunlight and transforming it into the chemical bonds of sugar. These tiny floating plants, invisible to the naked eye, form the foundation of an energy pyramid that extends from the lake's depths to the soaring peaks surrounding its shores. Zooplankton graze on the phytoplankton, small fish consume the zooplankton, larger fish prey upon the smaller ones, and osprey dive from great heights to snatch trout from the water's surface. At each transfer, energy flows upward through the food web, but with each step, much is lost to the metabolic demands of life itself, creating the predictable patterns that maintain stability in this alpine ecosystem. Energy flow through ecosystems follows fundamental physical laws that create inherent stability through limitation and loss. Unlike nutrients, which cycle continuously through ecosystems, energy moves in one direction only, entering through photosynthesis and gradually dissipating as heat through the metabolic processes of every living organism. This unidirectional flow creates natural constraints on ecosystem structure that prevent any single trophic level from dominating others, maintaining balance through the simple physics of energy transfer. The primary productivity of an ecosystem, the rate at which plants and other autotrophs convert sunlight into chemical energy, determines the total amount of energy available to support all other life within that system. This primary production creates the energetic foundation upon which all food webs rest, setting ultimate limits on the abundance and diversity of consumers that the ecosystem can sustain. Tropical rainforests, with their year-round growing seasons and abundant sunlight, achieve the highest primary productivity of terrestrial ecosystems, supporting the rich communities of herbivores, carnivores, and decomposers that make these environments legendary for their biodiversity. Marine ecosystems operate under different primary productivity constraints, with phytoplankton serving as the primary producers that capture solar energy. These microscopic plants must remain near the ocean surface to photosynthesize, creating a thin, productive layer that supports the entire marine food web. The vast majority of ocean volume lies below the euphotic zone, where photosynthesis is impossible, making marine ecosystems fundamentally dependent on the productivity of surface waters and the rain of organic matter that sinks from above. The efficiency of energy transfer between trophic levels creates one of ecology's most consistent patterns. On average, only about 10% of the energy consumed at one trophic level becomes available to the next level, with the remaining 90% lost to metabolic processes, incomplete consumption, and waste products. This 10% rule, while approximate, explains why food chains rarely extend beyond 4 or 5 levels and why top predators are always far less abundant than their prey. This energy transfer inefficiency acts as a natural regulator that prevents ecosystems from becoming top heavy with predators. Even the most efficient predators require vast numbers of prey organisms to support their populations, creating an inverted pyramid of abundance where each successive trophic level contains fewer individuals than the level below. A single hawk requires thousands of insects, hundreds of small birds, or dozens of rodents to meet its annual energy requirements, illustrating how energy constraints automatically limit predator abundance relative to prey. Herbivores face particular challenges in energy acquisition because plant tissues often contain significant amounts of indigestible material like cellulose and lignin. Many herbivores compensate through specialized digestive systems that house symbiotic microorganisms capable of breaking down these complex molecules. Ruminants like cattle and deer possess four-chambered stomachs where bacteria and protozoa ferment plant material, converting cellulose into compounds the animals can absorb. This mutualistic relationship allows herbivores to extract energy from food sources unavailable to animals lacking these specialized digestive partnerships. The energy demands of maintaining body temperature create additional constraints that influence ecosystem structure. Warm-blooded animals must expend considerable energy to maintain constant internal temperatures, particularly in cold environments. This energetic cost means that ectothermic animals like reptiles and insects can often achieve higher population densities than endothermic mammals and birds of similar size, creating different trophic structures in tropical versus temperate ecosystems. Seasonal variations in primary productivity create temporal patterns of energy availability that ripple through entire food webs. In temperate ecosystems, spring brings a burst of plant growth as trees leaf out and wildflowers bloom, creating abundant food resources that support rapid population growth in herbivorous insects and the birds that feed upon them. Summer maintains high productivity levels, but autumn's declining daylight and temperatures reduce primary production, forcing many animals to migrate, enter dormancy, or rely on stored energy reserves to survive winter's energy scarcity. These seasonal pulses of energy availability create predictable patterns of animal activity and reproduction that synchronize with periods of maximum food abundance. Many bird species time their breeding seasons to coincide with peak insect abundance, ensuring that energy demanding activities like egg production and chick rearing occur when food is most plentiful. Predators often adjust their own reproductive timing to match the emergence of young prey animals, creating cascading patterns of seasonal activity throughout food webs. Decomposer organisms play crucial roles in ecosystem energy flow by breaking down dead organic matter and making its stored energy available to other organisms. Without decomposers, dead plant and animal material would accumulate indefinitely, locking up nutrients and energy in forms unavailable to living organisms. Bacteria, fungi, and detritus-feeding invertebrates process this organic matter, releasing nutrients back into soil and water while accessing the energy needed for their own growth and reproduction. The efficiency of decomposer communities influences ecosystem productivity by controlling the rate at which nutrients become available for primary producer uptake. In tropical ecosystems where warm temperatures and high humidity support rapid decomposition, nutrients cycle quickly through the system, supporting high primary productivity despite often nutrient-poor soils. In contrast, cold or dry environments where decomposition proceeds slowly may accumulate large stores of organic matter in soils or sediments, temporarily removing nutrients from active cycling. Food web complexity creates multiple pathways for energy flow that enhance ecosystem stability through redundancy. Simple food chains with few connections between species create vulnerable systems where the loss of a single species can cascade through multiple trophic levels. Complex food webs with many interconnections provide alternative energy pathways that can compensate when particular species decline, maintaining energy flow and ecosystem function despite species turnover. Omnivory, where organisms feed at multiple trophic levels, creates additional stability by providing flexible feeding options that can adjust to changing prey availability. Bears exemplify this strategy by shifting between fish, berries, insects, and mammals, depending on seasonal availability and local abundance. This dietary flexibility allows omnivores to maintain stable populations despite fluctuations in any single food source, while providing consistent predation pressure on multiple prey species. Energy storage by individual organisms creates temporal buffers that help stabilize food webs during periods of low productivity. Many animals accumulate fat reserves during abundant periods that sustain them through times of scarcity. Trees store energy in their wood and root systems, allowing them to survive years of poor growing conditions and resume growth when favorable conditions return. These individual energy storage strategies aggregate into ecosystem level stability that moderates the impacts of environmental variability. Metabolic scaling creates predictable relationships between organism size and energy requirements that influence ecosystem structure. Large organisms generally have lower mass-specific metabolic rates than small organisms, meaning they require less energy per gram of body weight, but more total energy to maintain their populations. This scaling relationship helps explain why large predators exist at lower population densities than small predators, and why ecosystem energy pyramids become progressively narrower at higher trophic levels. The relationship between energy availability and ecosystem stability becomes apparent when primary productivity changes dramatically. Eutrophication, the artificial enrichment of ecosystems with nutrients, can cause explosive increases in primary productivity that destabilize food webs. Algal blooms, fueled by excess nitrogen and phosphorus, can produce more organic matter than consumer populations can process, leading to oxygen depletion when the excess algae decompose. These events demonstrate how energy flow patterns that evolved over long periods can become disrupted when productivity exceeds the processing capacity of existing consumer communities. Predator removal experiments reveal how energy flow patterns maintain ecosystem stability through top-down regulation. When large predators disappear from ecosystems, herbivore populations often increase dramatically, leading to overconsumption of primary producers and degradation of habitat quality. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park demonstrated this principle in reverse, as returning predators reduced elk populations and browsing pressure, allowing vegetation recovery that improved habitat for numerous other species. Climate change affects ecosystem energy flow through multiple pathways, including altered primary productivity, shifted seasonal timing, and changed species interactions. Warming temperatures may increase primary productivity in some ecosystems, while decreasing it in others, depending on temperature and moisture limitations. Changes in precipitation patterns can dramatically alter the timing and magnitude of energy pulses, potentially mismatching predator breeding seasons with prey abundance peaks. Understanding energy flow reveals it as the fundamental currency that shapes ecosystem structure and function. The physical laws governing energy transfer create inherent constraints that prevent runaway growth at any trophic level, while ensuring that energy remains available to support ecosystem processes. These constraints, combined with the complex pathways through which energy moves among species, create the stable patterns of abundance and interaction that characterize healthy ecosystems. The unidirectional flow of energy through ecosystems contrasts sharply with the cyclical movement of nutrients, which recycle continuously through living and non living components. While energy flows and dissipates, nutrients return to support new generations of primary producers, creating the circular pathways that sustain ecosystem productivity over geological timescales. In the depths of an ancient forest, a fallen oak lies slowly dissolving back into the earth. Fungi thread their way through its decaying wood, bacteria work within its softening bark, and countless invertebrates tunnel through its crumbling tissues. What was once a towering giant that captured carbon from the atmosphere for centuries now releases those same carbon atoms back to the soil and air. Some carbon will feed the microorganisms orchestrating this decomposition. Some will enrich the soil to nourish new seedlings, and some will return to the atmosphere to begin the cycle anew. This gentle transformation embodies one of nature's most fundamental principles. Nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed and recycled through pathways that have sustained life for billions of years. Nutrient cycling represents the circular economy of nature, where essential elements move continuously between living organisms and the physical environment in patterns that ensure these materials remain available to support new generations of life. Unlike energy, which flows through ecosystems and dissipates as heat, nutrients cycle endlessly through biological and geological processes that have operated since life first appeared on Earth. These cycles create the ultimate sustainability, where waste from one organism becomes food for another, and death becomes the foundation for new life. The carbon cycle forms perhaps the most familiar of these elemental journeys, linking the atmosphere, oceans, land, and all living organisms in a global network of exchange. Plants capture atmospheric carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, transforming it into the organic compounds that form the basis of all terrestrial food webs. Animals consume these plant materials, using some carbon for their own growth, while releasing the rest through respiration back to the atmosphere. When organisms die, decomposer organisms break down their tissues, gradually returning stored carbon to the atmosphere and soil through their metabolic processes. This biological carbon cycle operates within a much larger geological cycle that moves carbon through rock formations, ocean sediments, and the atmosphere over millions of years. Weathering of limestone and other carbonate rocks releases carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, while the formation of new carbonate rocks removes carbon dioxide from atmospheric circulation. Volcanic activity releases carbon stored deep within the earth, while the burial of organic matter in sediments removes carbon from active cycling for geological time periods. Ocean carbon cycling adds marine dimensions to this global process. Phytoplankton in surface waters capture atmospheric carbon dioxide just as terrestrial plants do, forming the base of marine food webs. Some of this carbon moves up through the food web to be released through marine animal respiration, while other carbon sinks to the deep ocean as dead organisms and organic particles settle toward the seafloor. Cold, deep waters hold more dissolved carbon dioxide than warm surface waters, creating a global ocean circulation system that transports carbon between surface and deep waters across ocean basins. The nitrogen cycle reveals even more complex pathways as this essential element moves between its various chemical forms. Atmospheric nitrogen, though abundant, exists as tightly bonded molecules that most organisms cannot use directly. Specialized bacteria possess the enzyme nitrogenase that can break these triple bonds, converting atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia through the energy-intensive process of nitrogen fixation. Some of these bacteria live freely in soil and water, while others form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, particularly in the root nodules of leguminous plants. Once fixed into ammonia, nitrogen can follow several pathways through ecosystems. Plants absorb ammonia and nitrate from soil, incorporating nitrogen into proteins and other essential molecules. Animals obtain their nitrogen by consuming plants or other animals, breaking down proteins to reuse the nitrogen atoms for their own biological molecules. When organisms die or excrete waste, decomposer organisms break down nitrogen-containing compounds, releasing ammonia back to the soil where it can be reused by plants or converted to other nitrogen forms by soil bacteria. Nitrification converts ammonia to nitrite and then nitrate through the activities of specialized bacteria, creating nitrogen forms that plants readily absorb, but that can also be lost from ecosystems through leaching into groundwater. Denitrification completes the cycle by converting nitrate back to atmospheric nitrogen gas, particularly in waterlogged soils where oxygen levels are low. This process removes nitrogen from ecosystems, balancing the inputs from nitrogen fixation and maintaining global nitrogen budgets over long time periods. Human activities have dramatically altered global nitrogen cycling through the industrial production of nitrogen fertilizers, fossil fuel combustion, and cultivation of nitrogen-fixing crops. These activities have more than doubled the amount of nitrogen circulating through Earth's ecosystems, leading to widespread eutrophication of lakes and coastal waters, where excess nitrogen triggers algal blooms that can create dead zones when the algae decompose. The phosphorus cycle operates differently from carbon and nitrogen cycles because phosphorus lacks a significant atmospheric reservoir. This element cycles primarily between rocks, soils, living organisms, and aquatic systems, with the vast majority of Earth's phosphorus locked in mineral form within rock formations. Weathering slowly releases phosphorus from rocks into soil solutions where plants can absorb it, but this process operates on geological timescales that make phosphorus availability a limiting factor in many ecosystems. Plants absorb phosphorus from soil and incorporate it into essential molecules like DNA, RNA, and ATP, the universal energy currency of cells. Animals obtain phosphorus by eating plants or other animals, concentrating this element in bones and teeth, where it provides structural strength. When organisms die, decomposer organisms release phosphorus back to soil, but much of it binds tightly to soil particles and becomes unavailable to plants. This inefficiency in phosphorus cycling means that many ecosystems remain phosphorus limited despite adequate supplies of other nutrients. Aquatic phosphorus cycling involves additional complexity, as this element can precipitate out of solution under certain conditions, settling to lake and ocean sediments where it becomes unavailable to organisms in surface waters. Upwelling of deep waters and sediment resuspension can return phosphorus to surface waters, but these processes operate irregularly and may not match the timing of biological demand for this essential nutrient. Mycorrhizal fungi play crucial roles in phosphorus cycling by extending plant root systems and producing acids that dissolve phosphorus containing minerals. These fungal partners can access phosphorus sources unavailable to plant roots alone, trading this scarce nutrient for carbon compounds from plant photosynthesis. The mutualistic relationship between plants and mycorrhizal fungi essentially creates biological mining operations that extract phosphorus from mineral sources and make it available to the broader ecosystem. Sulfur cycling involves both biological and geological processes that move this element between the atmosphere, soils, and living organisms. Volcanic activity and the weathering of sulfur containing rocks release sulfur compounds to the atmosphere and soil, while biological processes in marine environments produce dimethyl sulfide that transfers sulfur from oceans to the atmosphere. Acid rain, created when atmospheric sulfur compounds combine with water, returns sulfur to terrestrial ecosystems, though often in concentrations that damage plants and acidify soils. Decomposer organisms play central roles in all nutrient cycles by breaking down dead organic matter and releasing the elements contained within living tissues back to forms available for new biological uptake. The efficiency of decomposition determines how quickly nutrients cycle through ecosystems, with faster decomposition supporting higher productivity, but potentially leading to greater nutrient losses through leaching and volatilization. Temperature and moisture strongly influence decomposition rates, creating geographic patterns in nutrient cycling that help explain global patterns of ecosystem productivity. Tropical ecosystems with warm temperatures and abundant moisture support rapid decomposition that quickly returns nutrients to soil solutions where plants can reabsorb them. This rapid cycling maintains high productivity despite soils that contain relatively small nutrient reserves. Temperate and boreal ecosystems experience slower decomposition due to cooler temperatures and seasonal periods when microbial activity decreases. These systems often accumulate larger stores of organic matter in soils, creating reservoirs of nutrients that are released gradually over time. The slower cycling may limit short-term productivity, but provides buffering against nutrient losses and maintains fertility during periods of slow plant growth. Wetland ecosystems create unique conditions for nutrient cycling where waterlogged soils limit oxygen availability and slow decomposition processes. These conditions can lead to the accumulation of organic matter as peat, effectively removing carbon and other nutrients from active cycling for extended periods. Wetlands also create conditions favorable for denitrification, where nitrate is converted back to atmospheric nitrogen, helping regulate nitrogen levels in aquatic systems. Fire plays important roles in nutrient cycling by rapidly converting organic matter to ash while volatilizing nitrogen and other elements to the atmosphere. Post-fire nutrient pulses often stimulate rapid plant growth as minerals contained in ash become readily available for plant uptake. However, fires can also lead to significant nutrient losses if intense burning removes the entire organic layer from soils, or if heavy rains cause erosion of ash before plants can reestablish and stabilize soils. Climate change affects nutrient cycling through multiple pathways, including altered temperature and precipitation patterns, shifting plant species composition, and changes in soil microbial communities. Warming temperatures generally accelerate decomposition rates, potentially increasing nutrient availability, but also increasing losses through leaching and volatilization. Changes in precipitation patterns can alter the timing and magnitude of nutrient pulses, potentially creating mismatches between nutrient availability and plant demand. Understanding nutrient cycles reveals them as the circular foundations that support all ecosystem productivity and stability. These cycles operate across multiple spatial and temporal scales, from the rapid uptake and release of nutrients by soil microorganisms to the geological processes that move elements between rock formations and the atmosphere over millions of years. The efficiency and stability of these cycles determine ecosystem carrying capacity and resilience, creating the biogeochemical infrastructure that has sustained life through countless environmental changes. The intricate pathways through which nutrients cycle create both stability and vulnerability in ecosystems. While the circular nature of these cycles ensures long term sustainability, disruptions to cycling processes can cascade through entire food webs, affecting productivity, species composition, and ecosystem functions. As we explore further into ecosystem balance, we discover how environmental factors influence these fundamental cycles and the communities they support. On a windswept plateau in Yellowstone National Park, ancient whitebark pines cling to life at tree line, their gnarled branches sculpted by centuries of harsh winters and howling gales. These hardy survivors have weathered droughts that lasted decades, volcanic eruptions that buried the landscape in ash, fires that swept across entire mountain ranges, and ice ages that locked the region in glacial cold for thousands of years. Yet here they stand, some over 1,000 years old, their presence a testament to the remarkable resilience that allows ecosystems to maintain their essential character despite the constant buffeting of environmental change. Climate variability forms the rhythmic heartbeat of ecosystem dynamics, creating patterns of stress and relief that have shaped the evolution of all life on Earth. No ecosystem experiences constant conditions. Instead, all face fluctuations in temperature, precipitation, storm frequency, and seasonal timing that test the limits of species adaptations and community organization. These variations occur across multiple timescales, from daily temperature swings and seasonal cycles to multi-year droughts and ice ages that span millennia. Ecosystems have evolved sophisticated mechanisms to maintain stability despite this environmental variability. Resilience, the ability to absorb disturbance and return to original conditions, emerges from redundancy, diversity, and flexible responses that allow communities to bend without breaking. Like a reed that bends in strong winds rather than resisting rigidly, resilient ecosystems maintain their core functions while adapting their structure and composition to match changing environmental conditions. Resistance represents another form of stability, where ecosystems maintain their structure and function despite environmental stress. Highly resistant ecosystems show little change during disturbances, often through specialized adaptations that allow dominant species to persist through harsh conditions. Desert ecosystems demonstrate this type of stability through plants and animals adapted to extreme aridity and temperature fluctuations. These species remain active and functional during conditions that would eliminate most temperate species, maintaining ecosystem processes through environmental extremes. The distinction between resilience and resistance becomes apparent when comparing different ecosystem types. Tropical rainforests show high resistance to moderate disturbances, but limited resilience to severe disruptions like complete deforestation. Once cleared, tropical soils often lack the nutrients needed to support forest regrowth, leading to permanent conversion to grassland or scrubland. In contrast, temperate grasslands show limited resistance to disturbances like fire or drought, but demonstrate remarkable resilience through underground root systems and seed banks that allow rapid recovery once favorable conditions return. Disturbance regimes, the characteristic patterns of environmental disruption that ecosystems experience, play crucial roles in maintaining ecosystem structure and diversity. Regular moderate disturbances often enhance ecosystem stability by preventing any single species from completely dominating community composition. Fire provides a classic example of beneficial disturbance in many ecosystems. Periodic burning removes accumulated organic matter, recycles nutrients, creates gaps for new species establishment, and prevents the buildup of fuel loads that could cause catastrophic fires. Many plant species have evolved not merely to tolerate fire, but to depend on it for reproduction and competitive success. Lodgepole pines produce serotinous cones that remain sealed with resin until the heat of fire opens them, releasing seeds onto the nutrient-rich ash beds left by the flames. Jack pines follow similar strategies, creating post-fire forests dominated by even-aged stands that will persist until the next fire cycle. These fire adaptations demonstrate how disturbances become integrated into ecosystem functioning, creating stable cycles that persist for centuries. Flood regimes in riparian ecosystems create another example of disturbance-dependent stability. River systems naturally experience periodic flooding that scours channels, deposits sediments, and creates the diverse habitat mosaic that supports riparian biodiversity. Cottonwoods and willows require the bare mineral soils created by flooding for successful seed germination, while flood-adapted fish species depend on seasonal access to floodplains for spawning and nursery habitat. The timing, frequency, and intensity of disturbances determine their effects on ecosystem stability. Low frequency, high intensity disturbances like volcanic eruptions or major hurricanes can reset entire ecosystems, eliminating existing communities and initiating primary succession. High frequency, low intensity disturbances like annual floods or seasonal droughts may enhance diversity by creating environmental heterogeneity without eliminating dominant species. Intermediate disturbance theory proposes that moderate levels of disturbance maximize species diversity by preventing competitive exclusion while not eliminating species through excessive stress. This theory helps explain why many of the world's most diverse ecosystems, including coral reefs and tropical rainforests, experience regular but moderate disturbances that maintain community diversity through time. Pulse and press disturbances create different challenges for ecosystem stability. Pulse disturbances, like storms or wildfires, occur rapidly and then cease, allowing ecosystems to begin recovery immediately afterward. Press disturbances like drought or pollution persist over extended periods, requiring continuous adaptation and potentially leading to alternative stable states if the stress exceeds ecosystem tolerance limits. Drought represents one of the most widespread press disturbances affecting terrestrial ecosystems. Extended dry periods test the water storage and conservation capabilities of entire communities, often triggering cascading effects as water stress reduces primary productivity, increases fire risk, and concentrates animals around remaining water sources. Drought adapted ecosystems maintain stability through deep rooted plants, water efficient species, and behavioral adaptations that reduce water loss during stress periods. The 1,930 seconds Dust Bowl in the American Great Plains demonstrated what happens when ecosystems exceed their resistance limits. Prolonged drought, combined with intensive agriculture, eliminated the native grass cover that had maintained soil stability for thousands of years. Without deep prairie root systems to hold soil in place, massive dust storms carried away millions of tons of topsoil, creating an ecological and economic catastrophe that lasted for years. Storm disturbances create different patterns of ecosystem response depending on their characteristics and the ecosystems they affect. Hurricanes in coastal forests create complex mosaics of damage where some areas experience complete tree mortality while others suffer only minor crown damage. This patchy damage pattern creates diverse recovery conditions that enhance overall forest resilience by maintaining seed sources and refuge areas for forest species. Ice storms in temperate forests create unique disturbance patterns where mechanical damage from ice accumulation affects different tree species differently. Species with flexible branches and strong wood may bend under ice loads without breaking, while brittle species suffer extensive crown damage. These differential effects can shift forest composition over time, demonstrating how climate extremes influence ecosystem structure through selective pressure on different species. Invasive species represent a novel form of disturbance that can fundamentally alter ecosystem stability mechanisms. Unlike native disturbances to which ecosystems have adapted over evolutionary time, invasive species introduce new competitive pressures, predation patterns, or ecosystem engineering effects for which native species lack evolved responses. Successful invaders often establish positive feedback loops that reinforce their dominance and make ecosystem recovery to previous states difficult or impossible. Zebra mussels in North American freshwater systems exemplify how invasive species can create alternative stable states. These filter feeding mollusks can process enormous volumes of water, removing phytoplankton and shifting aquatic ecosystems from turbid productive states to clear, low productivity conditions. The physical structure created by zebra mussel shells alters bottom habitats, while their filtering activity changes nutrient cycling patterns, creating conditions that favor their continued dominance. Climate change represents an unprecedented press disturbance that challenges ecosystem stability mechanisms in multiple ways simultaneously. Shifting temperature and precipitation patterns alter the environmental conditions to which species and communities are adapted, potentially exceeding the tolerance limits that have allowed ecosystems to maintain stability through past climate variations. The rate of current climate change may exceed the ability of many species to adapt or migrate to suitable conditions, particularly for long lived species like trees that cannot rapidly adjust their distributions. This creates the potential for novel ecosystem states, with species combinations that have never existed in Earth's history, making it difficult to predict how these new communities will function or what their stability properties might be. Phenological mismatches illustrate how climate change can disrupt the timing relationships that contribute to ecosystem stability. Many species interactions depend on precise timing relationships that have evolved over thousands of years. If warming temperatures cause insects to emerge before migratory birds arrive, or if flowers bloom before their pollinators become active, these temporal disconnections can cascade through food webs and disrupt community stability. Tipping points represent thresholds beyond which ecosystems cannot maintain their current stable states and shift abruptly to alternative conditions. Arctic sea ice provides a clear example of a potential tipping point where reduced ice cover creates a positive feedback loop. Less ice means more dark ocean water is exposed to absorb solar radiation, causing further warming and ice loss that becomes self reinforcing once the process begins. Forest dieback represents another potential tipping point where drought stress, pest outbreaks, and fire risk combine to push forests beyond their recovery capabilities. Once tree mortality exceeds the forest's ability to regenerate, the ecosystem may shift permanently to grassland or shrubland states that create different climate conditions and support entirely different species communities. Understanding ecosystem resilience and resistance reveals them as properties that emerge from the complex interactions between species adaptations, community structure, and environmental variability. These properties are not fixed characteristics, but dynamic capabilities that can be enhanced or degraded by management decisions, land use changes, and global environmental changes. Maintaining ecosystem stability in an era of rapid environmental change requires understanding and protecting the mechanisms that generate resilience and resistance. This includes maintaining species diversity that provides functional redundancy, preserving habitat connectivity that allows species movements and genetic exchange, and protecting refugia that serve as source areas for ecosystem recovery following major disturbances. As we continue exploring ecosystem balance and equity, the capacity for recovery and adaptation that characterizes resilient systems leads naturally to examining how ecosystems change over time while maintaining their essential functions through the process of succession. On a rocky outcrop, newly exposed by a retreating glacier, the first signs of life appear as tiny lichens establish footholds in cracks and crevices. These hardy pioneers, part fungus and part alga, slowly dissolve the rock surface with mild acids, creating the first patches of primitive soil. Over decades, their growth and death add organic matter to these nascent soils, creating conditions suitable for hardy grasses and small shrubs. As centuries pass, the shrubs give way to pioneering trees, which eventually yield to the towering conifers that will dominate this site for millennia. This gradual transformation from barren rock to mature forest illustrates one of ecology's most fundamental processes, succession, where ecosystems achieve stability through predictable patterns of change. Succession represents the paradox of achieving balance through transformation, where ecosystems maintain their essential functions while continuously changing their species composition and physical structure. This process demonstrates how stability in nature often emerges from dynamic processes rather than static conditions, creating equilibrium through motion rather than rest. Each stage of succession modifies environmental conditions in ways that favor the next stage, while making the habitat less suitable for the current dominant species. Primary succession begins on surfaces where no previous ecosystem existed, such as newly formed volcanic islands, exposed bedrock after glacial retreat, or fresh lava flows that have sterilized the landscape. These harsh initial conditions can support only pioneer species with extraordinary tolerance for environmental extremes, and the ability to establish without assistance from other organisms. Lichens, with their dual nature combining algae that photosynthesize and fungi that extract nutrients from rock, represent ideal primary colonizers that can literally create soil from stone. The transformation of bare rock to fertile soil through lichen activity occurs with almost geological slowness, measured in centuries rather than years. As lichens grow and die, their organic matter mixes with rock particles weathered by their acid secretions, creating the first thin layers of soil. These patches attract hardy grasses and forbs, whose seeds arrive by wind or in the digestive systems of occasional bird visitors. The establishment of these first vascular plants marks a crucial transition point where succession begins to accelerate. Pioneer plants modify their environment in ways that facilitate their own replacement by more competitive species. Their roots create channels in soil and rock, allowing deeper water penetration and further weathering. Their leaf litter adds organic matter that improves soil structure and water retention. Their shade creates more moderate temperature conditions that favor species less tolerant of environmental extremes. These environmental improvements, while beneficial for the pioneer species in the short term, ultimately create conditions that favor taller, more competitive plants that can overtop and shade out the original colonizers. Secondary succession occurs on previously vegetated sites where disturbance has removed most or all plant cover but left soil intact. Old fields abandoned after agriculture, forest clear-cuts, and burned areas represent typical sites for secondary succession. Because soil structure, organic matter, and seed banks from previous plant communities remain, secondary succession proceeds much more rapidly than primary succession, often achieving mature forest conditions within decades rather than centuries. The specific pathway of secondary succession depends heavily on the type and severity of disturbance that initiated the process. Light disturbances that remove only canopy trees while leaving understory plants and soil relatively intact may show rapid recovery dominated by sprouting from surviving root systems. Severe disturbances that eliminate most vegetation and disturb soil structure may follow pathways more similar to primary succession, with pioneer species establishing from wind-blown seeds or distant source populations. Fire succession in temperate forests demonstrates how disturbance characteristics influence successional pathways. Light ground fires that consume only undergrowth and leaf litter may enhance rather than reset succession by reducing competition for established canopy trees and releasing nutrients bound in organic matter. Crown fires that eliminate entire forest stands initiate true secondary succession, often favoring different species assemblages than existed before the disturbance. Pioneer species share certain characteristics that allow them to colonize disturbed habitats successfully. High reproductive rates and effective seed dispersal mechanisms enable rapid colonization of suitable sites. Broad environmental tolerances allow establishment under the harsh, variable conditions typical of early successional sites. Fast growth rates help pioneers capture resources quickly and establish dominance before other species arrive. However, these same traits often make pioneers poor competitors against slower growing species with more conservative resource use strategies. Intermediate successional stages typically show the highest species diversity as pioneer and late successional species coexist before competitive exclusion eliminates the pioneers. This peak diversity occurs because environmental amelioration by pioneers creates conditions suitable for a broader range of species while competition has not yet intensified enough to exclude less competitive species. The resulting communities often include species from multiple successional stages, creating complex assemblages that gradually simplify as succession proceeds toward climax conditions. Late successional species possess traits that allow them to persist under the competitive conditions of mature ecosystems, but often limit their ability to colonize disturbed sites. Shade tolerance enables survival under closed canopies where light levels are insufficient for pioneer species. Efficient resource use allows persistence when nutrients become limiting through competition and biological immobilization. Long lifespans enable individuals to persist through environmental fluctuations that might eliminate shorter lived species. The climax concept represents the theoretical endpoint of succession, where species composition becomes relatively stable and self perpetuating. Climax communities develop when environmental conditions no longer favor species replacement, and the dominant species can successfully reproduce under the conditions they themselves create. These mature communities typically show lower net productivity than earlier successional stages, but maintain high biomass and complex structure that provides habitat for specialized species unable to persist in younger ecosystems. However, the reality of climax communities proves more complex than early ecological theory suggested. Rather than single predictable endpoints, most ecosystems show multiple potential stable states, depending on environmental conditions, disturbance history, and chance events during succession. Polyclimax theory recognizes that different soil types, slope positions, and moisture conditions within the same region may support different climax communities, creating landscape mosaics of mature ecosystem types. Gap dynamics in mature forests illustrate how climax communities maintain themselves through small scale disturbance and succession cycles. When individual trees or small groups of trees die, they create gaps in the forest canopy that initiate miniature succession sequences within the mature forest matrix. These gaps may be colonized by shade-intolerant species that cannot persist elsewhere in the mature forest, creating patches of different aged vegetation that enhance overall forest diversity and stability. Facilitation, tolerance, and inhibition models describe different mechanisms through which succession proceeds. Facilitation occurs when early colonizers modify environmental conditions in ways that make the habitat more suitable for later arriving species. The classic example involves nitrogen-fixing plants that enrich soils, allowing establishment of species requiring higher nitrogen levels. This positive feedback between successive species assemblages drives predictable changes in community composition. Tolerance models suggest that succession results from differences in species' abilities to establish and persist under changing environmental conditions rather than from direct facilitation. Species replacement occurs as environmental conditions change through natural processes, favoring species better adapted to the new conditions while eliminating those adapted to earlier conditions. This model explains succession in systems where early colonizers do not directly benefit later species. Inhibition models describe situations where early colonizers actively prevent establishment of other species through allelopathy, resource monopolization, or physical interference. Succession proceeds only when the inhibitory species die or become weakened by environmental stress, pests, or diseases. This model helps explain why some successional sequences stall for extended periods at particular stages. Cyclical succession occurs in ecosystems where disturbance regimes create recurring patterns of community change rather than linear progression towards stable climax conditions. Prairie ecosystems demonstrate cyclical succession where fire resets woody plant invasion and maintains grassland conditions indefinitely. Without periodic fire, prairies would succeed to woodland or forest, but regular burning prevents tree establishment and maintains the grass dominated ecosystem. Retrogressive succession describes situations where ecosystems become less complex over time due to nutrient depletion, soil degradation, or other factors that reduce site productivity. This process occurs commonly on nutrient poor soils, where slow nutrient cycling and leaching gradually reduce site fertility. Bog succession often follows retrogressive patterns as accumulating peat creates increasingly acidic, nutrient poor conditions that support progressively simpler plant communities. Oldfield succession in eastern North America provides a well studied example of secondary succession pathways. Abandoned agricultural fields are initially colonized by annual weeds and grasses, which give way to perennial grasses and herbaceous plants within a few years. Shrubs and small trees establish within a decade, creating woodland conditions that eventually develop into mature forest communities. However, the specific species involved and timing of transitions vary considerably depending on soil conditions, climate, surrounding vegetation, and land use history. Human activities profoundly influence succession through fragmentation, species introductions, altered disturbance regimes, and environmental changes. Urban and agricultural landscapes create novel environmental conditions that may support successional sequences unlike any that occurred historically. Invasive species can alter successional pathways by outcompeting native pioneers, changing soil conditions, or creating new disturbance patterns. Climate change adds uncertainty to successional predictions by altering the environmental conditions that determine which species can establish and persist at different successional stages. Species adapted to historical climate conditions may no longer be able to complete successional sequences, while species from different regions may colonize and create novel successional pathways. Understanding succession reveals it as a fundamental mechanism through which ecosystems maintain their functions while adapting to changing environmental conditions. This process creates stability through flexibility, allowing ecosystems to recover from disturbances and adjust to environmental changes while preserving essential ecological processes. The predictable patterns of succession provide insights into ecosystem restoration strategies and help explain the dynamic nature of ecological balance. Successional processes demonstrate that ecosystem stability does not require static species compositions, but can emerge from dynamic processes that maintain consistent functions through changing species assemblages. This principle becomes particularly important as we examine how biodiversity itself contributes to ecosystem stability through the insurance provided by having multiple species capable of performing similar ecological functions. In a small experimental plot in Minnesota grassland, researchers have been documenting an extraordinary phenomenon for over 2 decades. Plots containing just a few plant species show dramatic swings in productivity from year to year, thriving during favorable seasons but struggling during droughts or harsh winters. Meanwhile, nearby plots containing dozens of native prairie species maintain remarkably stable productivity regardless of weather conditions. When drought strikes, some species wither, while others thrive in the drier conditions. During wet years, moisture-loving species flourish, while drought-adapted species persist at lower abundance. This living experiment reveals one of ecology's most important principles. Diversity creates stability through the insurance provided by species with different responses to environmental variation. The relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem stability has captivated ecologists since the early days of the discipline, generating decades of research that has gradually revealed the complex mechanisms through which species diversity enhances ecosystem resilience and resistance. While intuition might suggest that diverse systems would be more chaotic and unpredictable than simple ones, empirical evidence consistently demonstrates that biodiversity acts as a stabilizing force that buffers ecosystems against environmental variability and disturbance. Species richness, the simple count of species present in a community, provides the most basic measure of biodiversity but tells only part of the stability story. A forest containing 50 tree species does not automatically show greater stability than one containing 25 species if the abundant species in each forest respond similarly to environmental stresses. The key lies not just in how many species are present, but in how those species differ from one another in their ecological roles, environmental responses, and resource requirements. Functional diversity captures these differences in species roles and responses, measuring the variety of ways that organisms acquire resources, process materials, and interact with their environment. A grassland containing grasses, legumes, forbs, and shrubs shows higher functional diversity than one containing only grass species, even if both communities contain the same total number of species. This functional variety creates complementarity effects, where different species use different resources or occupy different temporal and spatial niches, allowing more complete use of available resources and reducing competition-driven instability. The insurance hypothesis proposes that biodiversity provides stability through statistical averaging effects, where species with different responses to environmental variation buffer each other's fluctuations. In any given year, some species will experience favorable conditions and increase in abundance, while others face stress and decline. Over time, these individual species fluctuations tend to cancel each other out at the community level, creating aggregate stability that exceeds the stability of any individual species. This insurance effect becomes particularly apparent during extreme environmental events that push individual species beyond their tolerance limits. During severe droughts, species adapted to mesic conditions may experience dramatic population crashes, while drought-tolerant species maintain or even increase their populations. The presence of drought-tolerant species prevents total ecosystem collapse and maintains essential functions like primary productivity and nutrient cycling. When favorable conditions return, the recovering mesic species provide similar insurance against conditions that stress the drought-adapted species. Temporal complementarity demonstrates how species with different phenologies can stabilize ecosystem functions across seasons and years. In temperate forests, early flowering plants like spring ephemeral wildflowers capture resources and provide pollinator support before canopy trees fully leaf out. Summer active species take advantage of peak growing conditions, while late season species extend the productive period into autumn. This temporal spreading of resource use and ecosystem activity creates more consistent year-round function than would be possible with species active during only a single season. Spatial complementarity operates through similar principles, where species with different habitat preferences or rooting depths use resources unavailable to other community members. Prairie ecosystems demonstrate this beautifully through plants with different rooting strategies. Shallow-rooted grasses capture nutrients from recent precipitation and decomposing surface litter, while deep-rooted forbs access nutrients and water from lower soil layers. Nitrogen-fixing legumes tap atmospheric nitrogen sources unavailable to other plants. This spatial partitioning of resources allows prairies to maintain productivity across a wider range of soil and moisture conditions than would be possible with less functionally diverse plant communities. Response diversity describes variation in how species respond to environmental changes and disturbances. Even species that appear to fill similar ecological roles may respond differently to temperature changes, precipitation patterns, pest outbreaks, or other environmental stresses. This response diversity ensures that ecosystem functions can persist even when particular environmental conditions eliminate some of the species that normally provide those functions. Coral reef ecosystems illustrate response diversity through their fish communities. Multiple fish species may feed on algae growing on reef surfaces, but they differ in their responses to temperature changes, predation pressure, and habitat disturbance. During bleaching events that stress coral polyps, some herbivorous fish species maintain their feeding activity while others reduce their grazing. The continued presence of active herbivores prevents algal overgrowth that could prevent coral recovery, demonstrating how response diversity in seemingly redundant species maintains crucial ecosystem functions during stress periods. Portfolio effects create stability through mechanisms similar to financial investment diversification. Just as investment portfolios containing assets with uncorrelated price movements show lower volatility than portfolios concentrated in single asset types, ecosystems containing species with uncorrelated population dynamics show greater stability than those dominated by species that fluctuate together. The statistical properties of averaging across multiple independent variables create emergent stability at the ecosystem level that exceeds the stability of individual components. Keystone species complicate simple diversity stability relationships by demonstrating that ecosystem stability may depend more on particular species than on overall species richness. The removal of keystone species can cause dramatic changes in ecosystem structure and function, regardless of how many other species remain. Sea otters in kelp forest ecosystems, beavers in temperate wetlands, and large herbivores in grasslands all demonstrate how single species can have disproportionate effects on ecosystem stability. However, even keystone species benefit from having backup species that can provide similar functions when keystone populations decline. In African savannas, multiple large herbivore species create grazing effects that maintain grassland habitats. While elephants may act as keystone species in some areas, buffalo, zebras, and antelopes provide functional redundancy that maintains grazing pressure when elephant populations fluctuate. This redundancy among functionally important species creates more stable ecosystem dynamics than would exist if single keystone species carried the entire functional load. Rare species contribute to ecosystem stability in ways that their low abundance might not suggest. These species may become important during unusual environmental conditions that favor their particular adaptations. Drought-tolerant plants that persist at low abundance during normal years may become crucial for maintaining ecosystem function during extended dry periods. Cold tolerant species may provide similar insurance against unusual temperature extremes. Rare species also contribute to stability through their potential for population increases when conditions become favorable. Species maintained at low abundance by competition or predation pressure represent a biological reservoir that can rapidly expand when limiting factors are removed. This potential for compensatory growth provides ecosystems with the capacity to fill functional gaps created by disturbances that reduce dominant species. Network stability emerges from the complex patterns of interactions among species rather than simply from the number of species present. Food web research has revealed that ecosystem stability depends on the structure of feeding relationships, with some network configurations proving more stable than others. Highly connected networks, where each species interacts with many others, can show either enhanced stability through multiple pathways for energy flow or reduce stability if disruptions cascade rapidly through the web. Modularity in ecological networks enhances stability by creating semi-independent groups of interacting species that limit the spread of disruptions. If a disturbance affects one module of a food web, other modules may continue functioning normally, preventing system-wide collapse. Pollination networks often show this modular structure where groups of plants share pollinators within modules, but have fewer connections between modules. Diversity stability relationships vary with spatial and temporal scale, creating complex patterns that depend on the level of organization being examined. Individual populations may show greater variability in diverse communities due to increased competition and predation pressure, but community-level properties like total biomass or productivity typically show greater stability as diversity increases. Regional stability may benefit from diversity effects that operate across multiple local communities connected by dispersal and environmental gradients. Experimental manipulations of plant diversity in grassland ecosystems have consistently demonstrated positive relationships between species richness and various measures of ecosystem stability. Higher diversity plots show less year-to-year variation in productivity, greater resistance to invasion by exotic species, and faster recovery from disturbances. These experiments have been crucial for establishing causal relationships between diversity and stability rather than relying on correlational patterns that might reflect other underlying factors. Climate change creates new challenges for diversity stability relationships by introducing novel environmental conditions that may exceed the response diversity present in existing communities. Rapidly shifting temperature and precipitation patterns may eliminate species that provide crucial ecosystem functions while favoring others that lack the functional traits needed to maintain stability. The loss of response diversity may reduce ecosystem resilience to future environmental changes. Conservation implications of diversity stability relationships suggest that maintaining ecosystem stability requires protecting not just species richness, but the full spectrum of functional and response diversity present in natural communities. This means prioritizing conservation of rare species, maintaining habitat heterogeneity that supports diverse life strategies, and preserving landscape connectivity that allows species movements in response to environmental changes. Understanding biodiversity's role in ecosystem stability reveals it as a complex property that emerges from the intricate relationships among species with different ecological roles and environmental responses. This stability through diversity creates robust ecosystems capable of maintaining their essential functions despite the environmental variability and disturbances that characterize Earth's dynamic climate system. The diversity stability relationship demonstrates how ecosystems achieve resilience through the collective properties of their constituent species, but certain individual species exert disproportionate influence on stability through their particular ecological roles. These keystone species and ecosystem engineers create and maintain the conditions that allow diverse communities to flourish, forming crucial nodes in the network of interactions that maintain ecosystem balance. In the frigid waters of the North Pacific, a sea otter floats on its back, methodically cracking open sea urchins with a stone tool balanced on its chest. This seemingly simple act of foraging creates ripples of influence that extend far beyond the otter's immediate hunger. By controlling sea urchin populations, these marine mammals maintain the vast underwater kelp forests that stretch along thousands of miles of coastline. Without otters, urchin populations explode, creating underwater barrens where kelp once swayed in cathedral like groves. The kelp forests provide habitat for countless fish species, protect shorelines from storm damage, and sequester massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. One small mammal, weighing no more than 100 pounds, shapes entire marine ecosystems through its daily feeding activities. Keystone species earn their name from architecture, where the keystone holds an entire arch in place despite being just one stone among many. Remove the keystone, and the arch collapses regardless of how strong the other stones may be. In ecological terms, keystone species exert influence on ecosystem structure and function far out of proportion to their abundance or biomass. Their presence or absence determines whether entire communities thrive or collapse, making them crucial focal points for understanding how ecosystem balance is maintained. The concept emerged from Robert Payne's classic experiments with sea stars on rocky shores of the Pacific Northwest. By removing the predatory sea star Pisaster ocraceus from experimental plots, Payne discovered that mussel populations freed from their primary predator rapidly monopolized available space on the rocks. Within months, diverse intertidal communities containing dozens of species transformed into virtual monocultures dominated by mussels. The sea stars, despite representing a small fraction of the community's biomass, maintained diversity by preventing any single prey species from competitively excluding all others. This predatory keystone effect operates through top-down control, where predators regulate prey populations that would otherwise dominate their environments. Large carnivores often function as keystone species by controlling herbivore populations that would otherwise overgraze vegetation and simplify plant communities. Wolves in Yellowstone National Park demonstrate this pattern dramatically. Their removal in the early 20th century allowed elk populations to increase beyond the carrying capacity of their winter ranges, leading to severe overgrazing of willow and aspen in riparian areas. The absence of predation pressure changed elk behavior as well as their numbers. Without wolves, elk could linger in nutritious valley bottoms year-round, concentrating their browsing in areas that provided the best forage. Young trees and shrubs faced constant pressure that prevented their growth beyond ankle height, creating what ecologists call a browse line, where vegetation was cropped uniformly across the landscape. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995, their effects cascaded through multiple trophic levels in ways that surprised even seasoned ecologists. Elk populations declined through direct predation, but more importantly, elk behavior changed dramatically. The reintroduction of predation risk forced elk to become more vigilant and mobile, spending less time feeding in any single location and avoiding areas where escape routes were limited. This behavioral shift, termed the landscape of fear, allowed willows and aspens to recover in areas where they had been suppressed for decades. The returning woody vegetation stabilized stream banks, reducing erosion and creating deeper, more sinuous channels that supported beaver populations. Beavers, themselves ecosystem engineers, created additional habitat diversity through their dam building activities. Songbird populations increased in the recovering riparian forests, while the carrion provided by wolf kills supported scavenger populations, including ravens, eagles, and bears. Ecosystem engineers represent another category of species with disproportionate ecosystem influence. These organisms physically modify environmental conditions, creating habitat structure that other species depend upon. Unlike keystone predators that influence ecosystems primarily through their feeding relationships, ecosystem engineers alter ecosystems through their construction activities, burrowing behaviors, or other physical modifications of the environment. Beavers epitomize ecosystem engineering through their dam construction activities. These industrious rodents can transform flowing streams into complex wetland mosaics containing ponds, marshes, and meadows that support entirely different species assemblages than the original stream habitats. Beaver dams create habitat for waterfowl, amphibians, and aquatic insects while providing water storage that moderates downstream flooding and maintains base flows during dry periods. The hydrological modifications created by beaver dams extend their influence far beyond the immediate pond environments. Upstream from dams, reduced water velocity allows sediments to settle out, creating fertile meadows that support diverse plant communities. The seasonal flooding and draining of these areas creates distinct vegetation zones adapted to different moisture regimes. When beavers eventually exhaust local food supplies and abandon their ponds, the accumulated sediments behind the dams create rich soils that support productive grasslands for decades. Coral polyps function as ecosystem engineers in marine environments through their secretion of calcium carbonate skeletons that form the physical structure of coral reefs. These tiny animals, individually smaller than a pea, collectively create the most diverse marine ecosystems on Earth through their construction activities. The three-dimensional complexity of coral reefs provides habitat niches for thousands of fish species, countless invertebrates, and numerous other organisms that depend on the shelter and feeding opportunities created by coral architecture. The engineering effects of corals extend beyond simple habitat provision. Coral reefs modify local current patterns, wave energy, and water chemistry in ways that influence entire marine regions. Reef structures dissipate wave energy, protecting coastlines from storm damage while creating calm water environments that support seagrass beds and mangrove forests. The metabolic activities of coral reef communities influence local water chemistry and nutrient cycling patterns that extend well beyond the reef boundaries. Earthworms demonstrate ecosystem engineering at a smaller spatial scale through their effects on soil structure and chemistry. These humble invertebrates process enormous quantities of organic matter in soil, creating the well-aggregated soil structure that supports terrestrial plant communities. Darwin spent his later years studying earthworms, recognizing their fundamental importance to terrestrial ecosystems through their bioturbation activities. A single earthworm may process its own body weight in soil and organic matter daily, passing this material through its digestive system and depositing it as nutrient rich castings. The tunnels created by earthworm movement improve soil drainage and aeration while providing channels for root growth. The continuous mixing of soil layers by earthworm activity brings nutrients to the surface while incorporating organic matter into deeper soil layers, creating the complex soil profiles that support diverse plant communities. Prairie dogs exemplify ecosystem engineering through their extensive burrow systems that modify grassland environments across vast areas. A single prairie dog colony may contain thousands of burrows extending over hundreds of acres, creating a complex underground network that influences surface vegetation patterns, water infiltration, and habitat availability for numerous other species. The soil excavated during burrow construction creates mounds that alter local topography and drainage patterns. The grazing activities of prairie dogs maintain short grass areas around their colonies that provide habitat for species adapted to closely cropped vegetation. Many ground nesting birds prefer these areas for their improved visibility and reduced predator cover. The burrows themselves provide shelter for numerous species that cannot excavate their own underground homes, including burrowing owls, black-footed ferrets, and various reptiles and amphibians. Foundation species represent a third category of organisms with disproportionate ecosystem influence. These species literally form the foundation of ecosystem structure through their physical presence and dominance of community biomass. Unlike keystone species, which influence ecosystems despite low abundance, foundation species typically represent the most abundant organisms in their communities. Trees in forest ecosystems exemplify foundation species through their role in creating the three-dimensional habitat structure that defines forest environments. The presence of large trees creates distinct microclimate conditions, soil chemistry patterns, and habitat niches that determine which other species can persist in forest communities. Remove the trees, and the forest ecosystem ceases to exist, regardless of how many understory species might survive. Kelp in marine environments functions similarly as a foundation species that creates the physical habitat structure supporting diverse marine communities. Giant kelp forests create complex three-dimensional environments analogous to terrestrial forests, with distinct vertical zones that support different assemblages of fish, invertebrates, and other marine organisms. The kelp itself provides food resources, attachment surfaces, and shelter that hundreds of species depend upon. Foundation species often create positive feedback loops that reinforce their own dominance while maintaining ecosystem structure. Trees modify local climate conditions in ways that favor their own survival while creating conditions suitable for other forest species. Their root systems stabilize soils and improve water infiltration, while their leaf litter enriches soil chemistry and supports the decomposer communities that recycle nutrients back to the trees. The distinction between keystone species, ecosystem engineers, and foundation species sometimes blurs as individual species may fulfill multiple roles. Beavers function simultaneously as ecosystem engineers through their dam construction, keystone species through their effects on wetland diversity, and foundation species in the pond habitats they create. This multifunctionality makes certain species particularly crucial for ecosystem stability and particularly vulnerable points for conservation efforts. Climate change threatens keystone species, and ecosystem engineers through shifting environmental conditions that may exceed their tolerance limits or disrupt their ability to perform crucial ecosystem functions. Rising temperatures may push coral polyps beyond their thermal tolerance, causing widespread bleaching events that eliminate the foundation species supporting entire reef ecosystems. Changes in precipitation patterns may alter the hydrology that makes beaver engineering activities successful. Understanding keystone species and ecosystem engineers reveals how individual organisms can have cascading effects throughout entire ecosystems. These species represent critical control points where relatively small changes can trigger large-scale ecosystem transformations. Their identification and protection become crucial priorities for maintaining ecosystem stability in an era of rapid environmental change. As human activities increasingly alter natural ecosystems, the concepts of keystone species and ecosystem engineering take on new significance. Human beings themselves have become perhaps the most powerful ecosystem engineers in Earth's history, modifying environments on scales and at rates unprecedented in the geological record. Understanding how our engineering activities affect ecosystem balance becomes essential for managing the human impact on the natural world. In the heart of the Amazon rainforest, a bulldozer carves a straight line through what was once an unbroken expanse of green. Within hours, centuries of ecological development vanish beneath its tracks, leaving behind a raw scar of exposed soil where jaguars once padded silently through the undergrowth and hundreds of bird species called from the canopy above. This single machine, operated by a single human being, accomplishes in one day what would take a massive hurricane, volcanic eruption, or wildfire to achieve. The scale and speed of human impact on natural ecosystems has no precedent in Earth's history, challenging the very mechanisms that have maintained ecological balance for millions of years. Human beings have become the dominant ecological force on our planet, engineering environments on scales that dwarf the activities of beavers, prairie dogs, and other ecosystem engineers. Our species has learned to harness energy sources far beyond what photosynthesis can capture, extract materials from deep within the Earth's crust, and transport organisms across biogeographic barriers that once confined them to specific continents and islands. These capabilities have allowed human civilization to flourish, but they have also disrupted the natural regulatory mechanisms that maintain ecosystem stability. Habitat fragmentation represents one of the most pervasive ways human activities disrupt ecosystem balance. When continuous landscapes are broken into isolated patches by roads, agriculture, and development, the resulting habitat fragments often cannot maintain the species diversity and ecological processes that characterized the original intact ecosystems. Edge effects penetrate deep into forest fragments, altering light conditions, temperature, and humidity in ways that favor generalist species over forest specialists. Small habitat fragments lose species through a predictable process that ecologists call relaxation toward a new, lower equilibrium. Large predators disappear first because they require extensive territories and exist at low population densities that make them vulnerable to local extinction. Specialized species that depend on specific habitat conditions or resources vanish next, unable to persist in the simplified environments of small fragments. Eventually, fragments may contain only the most adaptable species, creating impoverished communities that bear little resemblance to the diverse ecosystems they replaced. The isolation of habitat fragments disrupts the metapopulation dynamics that allow many species to persist across heterogeneous landscapes. When local populations could freely exchange individuals through dispersal, temporary extinctions in some patches could be balanced by recolonization from source populations in other patches. Fragmentation breaks these connections, turning temporary local extinctions into permanent losses that gradually erode regional species diversity. Invasive species introductions create another major disruption to ecosystem balance by introducing novel species into communities that lack evolutionary experience with these new arrivals. The regulatory mechanisms that control native species populations, from specialized predators and diseases to competitive relationships, often prove ineffective against invaders that arrive without their natural controls. European starlings in North America, cane toads in Australia, and purple loosestrife in temperate wetlands demonstrate how invasive species can overwhelm native communities that lack effective responses to their presence. Some invasive species disrupt ecosystems by fundamentally altering physical habitat structure. Kudzu vines can completely smother native forest understories, creating novel ecosystems dominated by a single introduced plant. European earthworms in northern forests that evolved without earthworms create rapid changes in soil structure and leaf litter dynamics that favor different plant species than those adapted to the original earthworm-free conditions. Aquatic invasive species often prove particularly disruptive because aquatic systems provide fewer barriers to spread once invaders become established. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes have altered entire food webs by filtering enormous quantities of plankton from the water column, clarifying water to unprecedented levels while starving native filter feeding organisms. Asian carp species in North American rivers achieve such high population densities that they can comprise over 90% of fish biomass in invaded systems, fundamentally altering energy flow patterns through aquatic food webs. Pollution introduces toxic substances and excess nutrients that overwhelm the natural regulatory mechanisms of ecosystems. Heavy metals, pesticides, and synthetic chemicals often prove toxic to non-target organisms, eliminating key species and disrupting food web connections. DDT famously caused widespread declines in bird populations by thinning eggshells, while acid rain from sulfur emissions killed forests across large regions of eastern North America and Europe. Nutrient pollution creates different but equally serious disruptions to ecosystem balance. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural runoff and sewage discharge can trigger explosive growth of algae and aquatic plants that overwhelm natural regulatory mechanisms. These eutrophication events consume oxygen during decomposition, creating dead zones where most aquatic life cannot survive. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, created by nutrient runoff from the Mississippi River watershed, can exceed 8,000 square miles during peak summer conditions. Plastic pollution presents a novel challenge that exceeds the processing capabilities of natural decomposer organisms. Microplastics now contaminate ecosystems from the deepest ocean trenches to remote mountain lakes, accumulating in food webs where their effects remain largely unknown. The persistence of plastic materials means that this contamination will continue accumulating for centuries, potentially altering ecosystem functions in ways we cannot yet predict. Climate change represents perhaps the most pervasive human impact on ecosystem balance because it alters the fundamental environmental conditions that determine where species can survive and reproduce. The rate of current climate change exceeds the ability of many species to adapt or migrate to suitable conditions, particularly for long lived organisms like trees that cannot rapidly adjust their distributions. This creates the potential for widespread ecosystem disruptions as the environmental conditions that species are adapted to shift faster than the species themselves can respond. Phenological mismatches illustrate how climate change can disrupt the timing relationships that have evolved over thousands of years between interacting species. Earlier spring warming may cause flowers to bloom before their pollinators emerge from hibernation, or migratory birds to arrive after peak insect abundance has passed. These temporal disconnections can cascade through food webs, disrupting the synchronized relationships that contribute to ecosystem stability. Range shifts, driven by climate change, create novel species assemblages that have never existed in Earth's history, making it impossible to predict how these new communities will function. As species track suitable climate conditions across landscapes, they encounter different competitors, predators, and mutualistic partners than they evolved with, potentially creating unstable community dynamics that lack the regulatory mechanisms developed through long coevolutionary history. Ocean acidification, caused by absorption of excess atmospheric carbon dioxide, alters marine chemistry in ways that affect shell-forming organisms, including corals, mollusks, and many plankton species. As ocean pH declines, these organisms struggle to build and maintain their calcium carbonate structures, potentially disrupting the foundation species that create habitat for entire marine communities. Overexploitation directly removes species from ecosystems faster than their populations can recover, disrupting the regulatory relationships that maintain community balance. Commercial fishing has eliminated large predatory fish from many marine ecosystems, allowing their former prey species to increase dramatically and potentially alter entire food web structures. The collapse of cod populations in the North Atlantic triggered cascading effects that changed the species composition of entire marine regions. Hunting pressure on large terrestrial mammals has eliminated apex predators from most ecosystems worldwide, releasing herbivore populations from their primary population control mechanism. Without predation pressure, herbivore populations often grow beyond their habitat's carrying capacity, leading to overgrazing that simplifies plant communities and degrades habitat quality for numerous other species. Light pollution disrupts the natural cycles of darkness and light that many organisms depend upon for navigation, reproduction, and predator avoidance. Sea turtle hatchlings evolved to navigate toward the brightest horizon where the ocean reflects moonlight. Instead, crawl toward artificial lights and die on beaches and roadways. Migratory birds become disoriented by urban lighting, leading to massive mortality events during migration periods. Noise pollution from transportation, industrial activities, and urban development disrupts acoustic communication systems that many species rely upon for finding mates, avoiding predators, and coordinating social behaviors. Marine mammals that depend on long-distance acoustic communication for navigation and social coordination face particular challenges from increasing ocean noise levels created by shipping and industrial activities. The cumulative effects of multiple human impacts often prove more severe than any single impact alone. Stressed ecosystems struggling with habitat fragmentation become more vulnerable to invasive species, while climate change may push already stressed populations beyond their tolerance limits. These synergistic effects can trigger ecosystem collapses that exceed what might be expected from considering each impact in isolation. Urban ecosystems represent entirely novel environments that combine multiple human impacts in concentrated forms. Cities create heat islands, concentrate pollutants, fragment habitats, and introduce non native species while supporting human population densities that would be impossible without massive resource inputs from surrounding regions. Yet urban ecosystems also demonstrate the potential for creating new forms of human nature integration that may point toward more sustainable relationships between human activities and ecological processes. Understanding human impacts reveals them as disruptions to ecosystem balance that operate at scales and speeds for which natural regulatory mechanisms are inadequate. The challenge facing humanity involves learning to live within ecological limits while maintaining the technological capabilities that define modern civilization. This requires developing new approaches to ecosystem management that work with, rather than against, the natural processes that maintain ecosystem stability. The magnitude of human impacts on ecosystem balance makes restoration and conservation efforts increasingly urgent priorities for maintaining the ecological life support systems that human civilization depends upon. These efforts must address not only the symptoms of ecosystem disruption, but also the underlying patterns of resource use and environmental impact that created these problems. Along the banks of the Kissimmee River in Florida, what was once a sterile concrete channel has been transformed back into a meandering waterway lined with wetland plants and alive with returning wildlife. For decades, the river had been straightened and channeled for flood control, creating a lifeless conduit that moved water quickly from north to south while supporting almost no natural ecosystem functions. But through one of the world's most ambitious restoration projects, engineers removed the concrete and allowed the river to reclaim its original serpentine path through the landscape. Within years, wading birds returned in massive numbers, fish populations recovered, and the surrounding wetlands began filtering nutrients and storing floodwaters just as they had for thousands of years before human intervention. This remarkable transformation illustrates humanity's growing understanding that we can not only damage ecosystems, but also repair them through careful application of ecological knowledge. Restoration ecology has emerged as a hopeful discipline that seeks to accelerate the recovery of degraded ecosystems by working with, rather than against, the natural processes that maintain ecological balance. These efforts demonstrate that while human activities have disrupted ecosystem stability on unprecedented scales, our species also possesses the knowledge and tools needed to help ecosystems regain their self-regulating capabilities. Ecological restoration operates on the principle that ecosystems possess inherent tendencies toward recovery when limiting factors are removed and appropriate conditions are established. Rather than trying to control every aspect of ecosystem development, successful restoration projects typically focus on reestablishing the fundamental processes that allow ecosystems to organize themselves into stable, functioning communities. This approach recognizes that ecosystems are too complex for humans to manage in detail, but that we can create conditions that encourage natural regulatory mechanisms to reassert themselves. Passive restoration strategies rely on natural recovery processes once human disturbances are removed. When degraded lands are simply protected from further disturbance, many ecosystems begin recovery through natural succession, seed dispersal, and wildlife recolonization. The recovery of eastern North American forests following agricultural abandonment demonstrates the power of passive restoration. Millions of acres of farmland abandoned during the 20th century have naturally reverted to forest through succession, supporting recovering populations of forest dependent species and reestablishing many ecosystem services. However, passive restoration works best when degraded sites retain their fundamental ecological infrastructure, including appropriate soils, nearby seed sources, and intact hydrological patterns. Sites that have lost these foundation elements often require active restoration interventions to restart recovery processes. Severely degraded sites may remain locked in alternative stable states that prevent natural recovery even when disturbances cease. Active restoration involves direct human intervention to accelerate ecosystem recovery through seeding or planting native species, modifying physical conditions, or reintroducing missing ecological components. The most successful active restoration projects work by reestablishing keystone species, ecosystem engineers, or foundation species that can trigger cascading recovery effects throughout entire ecosystems. Reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone represents a famous example where adding a single keystone species initiated widespread ecosystem changes that would have been impossible to achieve through managing individual species or habitats. Separately, wetland restoration demonstrates how reestablishing fundamental physical processes can trigger comprehensive ecosystem recovery. Many wetland restoration projects begin by reestablishing appropriate hydrology through removing drainage tiles, plugging ditches, or building low dams that recreate seasonal flooding patterns. Once appropriate water regimes are established, native wetland plants often colonize naturally from seed banks in the soil or from nearby source populations. The returning vegetation then provides habitat for wetland dependent wildlife while reestablishing ecosystem services, including flood control, water purification, and carbon storage. Prairie restoration has revealed both the challenges and possibilities of reconstructing complex ecosystems from degraded agricultural lands. Successful prairie restorations require careful attention to soil conditions, appropriate seed mixes that include both dominant grasses and numerous forb species, and management practices, including prescribed burning that maintain prairie conditions over time. The most successful prairie restorations often take decades to develop the species diversity and ecological complexity of original prairie ecosystems, demonstrating that restoration is a long-term process that requires sustained commitment and adaptive management. The restoration of tallgrass prairie ecosystems has shown how important functional diversity proves for ecosystem stability. Early restoration efforts that focused primarily on establishing dominant grass species often created communities vulnerable to drought stress and invasive species establishment. More recent approaches that emphasize establishing diverse plant communities, including deep-rooted forbs, nitrogen-fixing legumes, and plants with different seasonal activity patterns have created restored prairies that show greater resilience to environmental stresses and resistance to invasion. Forest restoration faces unique challenges because forest ecosystems develop over decades to centuries, making it difficult to evaluate restoration success within human timescales. Successful forest restoration often requires attention to soil conditions that may have been severely altered by agriculture or other land uses. Mycorrhizal inoculation, where appropriate fungal partners are introduced to support tree establishment, has proven crucial for forest restoration on severely degraded sites where soil biological communities have been eliminated. Species reintroductions represent another approach to restoration that focuses on returning missing ecological components to degraded ecosystems. The California Condor Recovery Program demonstrates both the challenges and successes possible through intensive species management. By the 1,980 only 27 California condors remained in existence, all in captivity. Through careful captive breeding, habitat protection, and reduction of lead poisoning from ammunition, condor populations have slowly recovered to over 500 individuals, with more than half now living in the wild. However, species reintroductions succeed only when appropriate habitat conditions exist and when the factors that caused original population declines have been addressed. Wolf reintroductions have succeeded in areas where adequate prey populations and suitable habitat remain, but have failed in regions where human activities continue to create unsurmountable obstacles to wolf survival. The success of species reintroductions often depends as much on social and political factors as on biological considerations. Marine restoration presents unique challenges because ocean ecosystems are largely open systems where restoration sites cannot be isolated from external influences. Coral reef restoration efforts have experimented with techniques including coral fragment transplantation, artificial reef structures, and reducing local stresses like pollution and overfishing. However, the success of these efforts ultimately depends on addressing larger scale threats, including climate change and ocean acidification, that operate beyond the scale of individual restoration sites. Kelp forest restoration efforts have shown more success by focusing on removing the proximate causes of kelp decline, particularly sea urchin population explosions that create underwater barrens. By reducing urchin populations through targeted removals or by reestablishing sea otter populations, restoration efforts have successfully triggered kelp recovery over large areas. These successes demonstrate the importance of understanding the specific mechanisms causing ecosystem degradation before designing restoration interventions. River and stream restoration has evolved from simple approaches focused on fish habitat improvement to more comprehensive efforts that address entire watershed processes. Modern stream restoration often involves removing dams and other barriers to natural flow patterns, allowing rivers to reestablish their natural channel morphology and floodplain connections. The removal of dams on the Elwha River in Washington state triggered rapid ecosystem recovery as salmon populations rebounded and sediments trapped behind the dams began rebuilding coastal beaches and estuaries. Urban restoration presents novel challenges and opportunities for creating functional ecosystems within human dominated landscapes. Green infrastructure projects that incorporate native plant communities into urban stormwater management systems demonstrate how restoration can provide both ecological and human benefits. Constructed wetlands that treat urban runoff while providing wildlife habitat show how restoration can be integrated into urban planning to create more sustainable cities. Conservation strategies have evolved to emphasize maintaining intact ecosystems and their natural regulatory mechanisms rather than trying to manage individual species in isolation. Landscape scale conservation approaches recognize that ecosystem stability emerges from processes that operate across large spatial scales and that cannot be maintained within small, isolated protected areas. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative exemplifies this approach by working to maintain habitat connectivity across an entire mountain ecosystem that spans international borders. Conservation corridors that connect protected areas through networks of natural and semi natural habitats allow species movements and genetic exchange that maintain the population dynamics necessary for ecosystem stability. These corridors prove particularly important for large mammals that require extensive territories and for maintaining the migration routes that many species depend upon for completing their life cycles. Protected area management has shifted from preserving pristine wilderness toward maintaining dynamic ecosystems that require active management to remain functional. Fire management in many protected areas now emphasizes restoring natural fire regimes rather than suppressing all fires, recognizing that fire adapted ecosystems require periodic burning to maintain their species composition and ecological functions. Adaptive management approaches recognize that ecosystem restoration and conservation require continuous learning and adjustment as new information becomes available. Restoration projects are designed as experiments that test different approaches while monitoring ecosystem responses to determine which techniques prove most effective. This approach acknowledges the complexity and unpredictability of ecosystem dynamics while providing frameworks for improving restoration success over time. Climate change adds new urgency and complexity to restoration and conservation efforts by creating novel environmental conditions that may exceed the tolerance limits of historical ecosystem configurations. Assisted migration involves moving species to new locations where climate conditions are expected to remain suitable as historical habitats become unsuitable. However, these approaches raise complex questions about which species to move and where to place them in landscapes that are themselves changing rapidly. The success of restoration and conservation efforts ultimately depends on addressing the underlying drivers of ecosystem degradation, including habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, and climate change. Local restoration projects cannot succeed if regional or global processes continue to degrade the environmental conditions necessary for ecosystem stability. This reality requires integrating restoration and conservation efforts with broader changes in human land use, resource consumption, and environmental impact. Understanding restoration and conservation reveals them as applied expressions of our growing knowledge about how ecosystems maintain their balance and stability. These efforts demonstrate humanity's capacity to work constructively with natural processes rather than simply exploiting or ignoring them. As we face an uncertain environmental future, restoration and conservation provide hopeful examples of how human activities can support rather than undermine the ecological processes that sustain all life on Earth. In the laboratory of a marine research station, scientists tend to coral polyps, growing in carefully controlled aquariums where they can gradually adjust temperature and acidity levels to match projections for ocean conditions 50 years into the future. Some coral colonies bleach and die under these simulated future conditions, but others show remarkable resilience, maintaining their symbiotic algae and continuing to grow even as their environment changes beyond anything their ancestors experienced. These surviving corals carry genetic variants that may hold keys to ecosystem survival in a rapidly changing world, representing evolution in action as natural selection favors organisms capable of thriving under novel environmental conditions. The future of ecosystem balance unfolds within the context of unprecedented global change, driven by human activities that continue to accelerate despite growing awareness of their consequences. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels climb toward concentrations not seen for millions of years. Global temperatures rise at rates that exceed most historical climate changes, and species extinctions occur at paces rivaling the great mass extinction events of the geological past. Yet within this context of rapid change, natural systems demonstrate remarkable capacity for adaptation, reorganization, and the emergence of new forms of stability. Climate change represents the most pervasive force reshaping ecosystem balance across the planet. As temperature and precipitation patterns shift, species ranges move toward cooler regions and higher elevations, creating novel species assemblages that have never existed in Earth's history. The spruce fir forests of high mountains find themselves with nowhere to retreat as warming temperatures push optimal growing conditions beyond available habitat. Arctic ecosystems face complete transformation as ice-dependent species lose their habitat foundation, while temperate species colonize newly ice-free areas. These climate-driven changes do not necessarily lead to ecosystem collapse, but rather to the emergence of new forms of balance adapted to altered environmental conditions. Ecological communities possess remarkable flexibility in their species composition while maintaining essential functions through the principle of functional redundancy. When climate change eliminates particular species, others with similar ecological roles may expand to fill vacant niches, allowing ecosystem processes to continue despite changed species assemblages. Phenotypic plasticity allows individual organisms to adjust their characteristics in response to changing environmental conditions without requiring genetic changes. Trees growing under elevated carbon dioxide concentrations often show altered leaf chemistry and growth patterns that help them take advantage of increased atmospheric carbon while tolerating associated temperature changes. Many bird species adjust their breeding timing to match shifting food availability as warming temperatures advance the emergence of insects and the blooming of plants. Evolutionary adaptation provides longer-term responses to environmental change through genetic changes that enhance survival and reproduction under new conditions. Urban environments create novel selection pressures that favor different traits than natural habitats, leading to rapid evolutionary changes in city-dwelling populations of many species. House finches in cities have evolved different songs that penetrate urban noise better than rural bird songs. Urban plants often evolve tolerance to air pollution, salt from road treatment, and altered soil chemistry. The pace of current environmental change tests the limits of evolutionary adaptation, particularly for long-lived species that reproduce slowly and have limited ability to disperse to new suitable habitats. However, genetic diversity within species provides the raw material for evolutionary responses to environmental change. Populations with higher genetic diversity show greater ability to adapt to changing conditions, highlighting the importance of maintaining large, genetically diverse populations as insurance against uncertain environmental futures. Assisted evolution represents a controversial approach where humans actively promote evolutionary adaptation through selective breeding or genetic techniques that enhance species' ability to survive under predicted future propagating conditions. Coral restoration projects increasingly focus on identifying and propagating heat-tolerant coral genotypes that may be better able to survive projected ocean warming. Forest management programs plant tree seedlings from warmer, drier regions in areas expected to experience hotter, drier conditions as climate change progresses. Range shifts allow species to track suitable climate conditions across landscapes as environmental zones move in response to changing temperature and precipitation patterns. Many species already show range shifts toward higher latitudes and elevations as they follow optimal climate conditions. However, habitat fragmentation by human land uses creates barriers to these natural range adjustments, potentially trapping species in areas where conditions are becoming unsuitable. Conservation corridors that connect suitable habitats across large landscapes become increasingly important for allowing species to adjust their ranges in response to climate change. The concept of climate corridors focuses specifically on maintaining connectivity along elevation and latitudinal gradients that species must traverse to track suitable conditions. These corridors require cooperation across property boundaries and political jurisdictions to maintain landscape scale connectivity. Novel ecosystems emerge when environmental changes create conditions that differ significantly from any historical ecosystem state, often combining native species with non native species in assemblages that have never existed previously. Urban ecosystems represent obvious examples of novel ecosystems, but climate change creates novel conditions in natural areas as well. Future ecosystems may include species combinations that seem unusual from our current perspective, but represent functional solutions to new environmental challenges. The management of novel ecosystems requires new approaches that focus on maintaining ecosystem functions rather than preserving historical species compositions. If native species cannot persist under changed environmental conditions, managers may need to accept non native species that can provide similar ecological functions. This represents a fundamental shift from historical preservation toward adaptive management that prioritizes ecosystem services and functional diversity over species authenticity. Tipping points in global environmental systems create the potential for abrupt changes that could fundamentally alter the context within which all ecosystems operate. The collapse of major ice sheets could trigger sea level rises that eliminate coastal ecosystems worldwide. Changes in ocean circulation patterns could alter regional climate conditions faster than species can adapt or migrate. The release of methane from thawing permafrost could accelerate global warming beyond the tolerance limits of many current ecosystems. However, ecosystems also possess tipping points that could lead to positive changes. Reforestation efforts that reach critical thresholds might trigger positive feedback loops, where forests begin expanding naturally through improved seed dispersal and microclimate modification. Marine protected areas that allow predator populations to recover might trigger cascading changes that restore entire marine ecosystems to more natural states. Technological approaches to ecosystem management continue advancing through remote sensing, genetic analysis, and artificial intelligence applications that provide unprecedented ability to monitor ecosystem changes and predict future conditions. Satellite imagery allows tracking of forest cover, wetland extent, and species migrations across global scales. Environmental DNA techniques enable detection of species presence from water or soil samples, revolutionizing biodiversity monitoring. Machine learning algorithms process vast data sets to identify patterns and predict ecosystem responses to environmental changes. Synthetic biology raises the possibility of engineering organisms specifically designed to address environmental challenges or restore ecosystem functions. Researchers explore creating microorganisms that can break down plastic pollution, coral probiotics that enhance heat tolerance, or trees engineered for rapid carbon sequestration. However, these approaches raise ethical questions about the appropriate level of human intervention in natural systems and the potential for unintended consequences. Urban ecology increasingly influences thinking about future ecosystem management as growing human populations concentrate in cities. Urban ecosystems demonstrate that highly modified environments can still provide important ecosystem services and support significant biodiversity when designed thoughtfully. Green infrastructure that incorporates natural systems into urban planning shows potential for creating more sustainable cities that work with, rather than against, ecological processes. The concept of planetary boundaries suggests that Earth's systems operate within safe ranges for key environmental variables, including climate, biodiversity, nitrogen cycling, and ocean acidity. Human activities have already pushed several of these systems beyond their historical ranges, creating global environmental conditions unlike any experienced during human civilization. Staying within planetary boundaries may require fundamental changes in human resource use and environmental impact that align with, rather than overwhelm, natural regulatory mechanisms. Indigenous knowledge systems offer perspectives on ecosystem management that emphasize long term sustainability and working within natural cycles rather than dominating them. Traditional ecological management practices often incorporate disturbance regimes like controlled burning that maintain ecosystem health while providing human benefits. These approaches may provide models for future ecosystem management that integrates human needs with ecosystem health. Education and public engagement become crucial for building support for the long term ecosystem management strategies needed to maintain stability in a changing world. Understanding ecosystem balance helps people recognize their dependence on natural systems and the importance of maintaining healthy ecosystems for human well being. This understanding can motivate individual actions and support for policies that prioritize ecosystem health alongside economic development. International cooperation proves essential for addressing global environmental changes that cross all political boundaries. Migratory species require coordinated conservation efforts across multiple countries. Ocean pollution affects marine ecosystems far from its sources. Climate change creates global impacts that require coordinated responses. The Paris Agreement and other international environmental treaties represent early efforts to build the global cooperation needed to address planetary scale environmental challenges. As we look toward an uncertain environmental future, the principles of ecosystem balance provide hope that natural systems possess remarkable capacity for adaptation and renewal. The regulatory mechanisms that have maintained life on Earth for billions of years continue operating, though under conditions unlike any in human experience. Understanding these mechanisms helps us work constructively with natural processes rather than against them, creating opportunities for both human prosperity and ecosystem health in the centuries ahead. The story of ecosystem balance ultimately reveals that stability emerges not from rigidity, but from flexibility, not from simplicity, but from complexity, and not from human control, but from natural processes that have been refined over vast spans of evolutionary time. By learning to work within these processes rather than attempting to override them, humanity may yet find ways to maintain both technological civilization and the ecological life support systems upon which all life depends. The future of ecosystem balance lies not in some distant tomorrow, but in every choice we make today about how to live as part of, rather than apart, from the natural world that sustains us all.